The Projection Booth podcast is sponsored by Scarecrow Video. Try out Scarecrow's rent-by-mail service. Choose from over 150,000 films and get Blu-rays, 4Ks, and DVDs delivered directly to your door. Visit scarecrow.com today.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
So, Stephen.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Join me once again is Ms. Samm Deighan.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Ms. Jessica Shires.
Hello.
On this episode, we are fulfilling a Patreon request from Jessica Shires about Just Jaeckin. Is that right? How we say that? Just Jaeckin?
Just Jaeckin, I believe.
Sure. It's probably going to be Just Jaeckin when I say it. So, the story of O. The film stars Corinne Cléry as the titular O, who's taken to a chateau in Roissy by her lover René, played by Udo Kier. He eventually gives her to another man, Sir Stephen, or Stefan in this movie, and tries to initiate a model into a turn at the chateau herself. The film is based on the notorious novel by Anne-Cécile Desclaux, who also wrote under the pen names Dominique Aury and Pauline Réage. Yeah, I'm going to be butchering all this French as we go along, so buckle in. We will also be spoiling this film as much as we can, so as well as the sequels and tangentially related TV shows, films, all that kind of stuff. So if you don't want anything ruined, turn off the podcast and come back after you've had an O orgy. We will still be here. So Jessica, when was the first time you ever heard of the story of O?
I discovered the story of O via the book when I was a teenager. And I don't remember how I came to be aware that it was a notorious book, but I was working in a bookstore at the time. I was in high school. I was already interested in banned and transgressive literature at that age, and I came across it. And for anyone who's seen like the sort of most well-known edition of this book, it's incredibly plain. Like it has a white cover with black text on it. There's nothing like on it that would make you go, ooh, wow, like this could be very salacious. It's incredibly, almost like the equivalent of like brown paper wrapping, basically. I was working and I was bored and I picked it up and thumbed through it and I was, whoa, that's obviously like very immediately shocked and also intrigued. And I bought the book, I took it home and read it. And like I said, it just became part of this canon of Story of the Eye and the Desaad I was discovering at the time. So it just came in that canon of banned transgressive literature and just solidified something for me culturally that just turned me into the adult that I am, for better or worse. I became aware of the film version around the early 2000s. That was the first time I had become aware that a film had been made of the book. And I was very excited because I was just like, wow, how are they going to turn this into a movie? And I bought the DVD, which I still have. I loved it. I obviously, and I'm sure we'll talk plenty about how the film differs from the book, but it was so lush. It was so pretty. But it had so much of the story in it and felt, at least to me at that age, taking it in on a first watch, it just felt, this is what I would want to see. So I was pretty excited about it. And I've long had an interest in European softcore. So for me, it's just always been part of that group of European softcore films, many of which were adapted from works of literature that just have always been like near and dear to my heart. The reason why I picked it up, and Mike will probably remember this conversation I had with him, is because I was thinking about how the similarities that the film and the book have with Jean de Berg's book, The Image. And I asked if I could do a double. I didn't want to be greedy, but I wanted to be like, I've been thinking about this and I feel like I have a lot to say about it. Is there any chance I could do these as a double episode? And then when Mike suggested breaking them out and doing an episode on each, which I think is great and was very generous. And I'm very excited to do. I feel like I will also probably bring up a lot about how this film is similar and different from The Image, which came out the same year.
And Sam, what's your history with Story of O?
Honestly, pretty similar. I got really into the Marquis de Sade way too young of an age. And from there, it was inevitable to similarly look through what are other transgressive novels and stories that I might be interested in. And this was the first thing I came across after reading Sade. Again, found it in fucking Barnes and Noble, looking innocuous as all get out, with the cover that, like, as a 14-year-old, no one was like, maybe you shouldn't buy that. But I fell in love with the book. I love both of the books that she wrote. There's also the sequel, Return to Roissy. But I found the film at some point in college or my early 20s and was just like shocked to see that the guy who directed Emmanuel made a Story of O adaptation with Udo Kier of all people. It's one of those things that might be actually hard for me to talk about, because, at least in a more objective way, because the novel is such an important part of my life. And while I have issues with the film, it's still a good representation of it, or at least tries to be.
So I think I found Story of O not at a bookstore, but in a dumpster.
Whoa.
We used to go dumpster diving a lot, my friends and I, when I was growing up, and there was a bookstore maybe like half mile from my house, and we were going through behind all of the dumpsters behind all of these businesses. It was one of these strip malls, and there was a dumpster that was just filled with books. And we were like, oh, well, this is interesting. Like, let's go through all of these books. And what's the matter with these books? These are all brand new. They were all missing the front cover, though. So they were basically like unsold books, and the bookstore was just getting rid of them. And this is before recycling was really a thing. So they just were throwing out all of these books. So we went in and we just took as many of these as we possibly could. And Story of O was one of them. And so we didn't even have the innocent front cover. We just had the 4-page of it. And I ended up with this copy of it. And I remember trying my best to get through it. And I'm very curious if this is going to be like one of these weird man-women things as we're talking about this. But the book of this, it's like the stuff I want to read about is not the stuff that she concentrates on. It's like the sex, the oral sex, anal sex, regular homogenous sex, the whippings, all these things. She just states them so plainly, like, and then this happened, and then this happened. Whereas still am all of these years later, like, no, I want the details. Like, give me the details of that stuff. I don't really care about your relationship with René and Sir Stephen. I want the juicy details. Like, give me all that stuff. So I wasn't even really aware that there was a movie of Story of O until, I don't know, maybe I was in my late 20s, and I would never watch it until we watched it for this episode. So this was a brand new experience for me. And then I forced myself to listen to the entire Story of O because I never made it. I never made it to Sir Stephen. So I just knew René, and I really didn't know Sir Stephen.
Which is interesting. That was your issue with the novel. And I think it makes perfect sense because I do think she makes an effort to de-eroticize that aspect of it. So yes, of course, we're here to talk about the movie, but I think both are hard to talk about because you can take so much away from them both. Obviously, I think anyone who knows about the novel and the film has heard about how misogynistic it is and how it's all about the male gaze and blah, blah, blah. But it's so much more complicated than that. And I think part of what makes it complicated is how she's just like very face value. This is what's happening. I'm not going to make it spicy or titillating or eroticized. And certainly I think parts of the book, at least to me, are erotic, but it's like when you least expect it.
Yeah, I totally agree. For people who are just looking to read a dirty book, who pick this up are probably going to be disappointed. And not to say that this was you, Mike, because it is, as you guys are saying, it is very matter of fact. And dare I say, the language that Réage Aury Diclo uses, she shies away from being vulgar. There are no bad words in this book. When she's talking about body parts, it's almost like, not scientific, but it's very, again, matter of fact. She never uses like the F word, whereas a lot of other even high literary pornographic books would use coarse language. She doesn't resort to that. In fact, when she talks about other characters using this kind of language, she just says things like, they described her body in the most coarse language. She does not reproduce what was said. That's probably when that kind of language is being used, but she avoids reproducing it. There's just a level that it exists on because it avoids doing those things that is unexpected for a reader going into it who may not know what to expect from this. And again, to Sam's point, I think in talking about the film, I think we have to talk quite a lot about the book because, number one, it's so influential not only on the fact that it was made a movie and several adaptations have been made of it, but also that it's influenced generations of artists. And there's a sort of like cultural dialogue that the history of the novel and the writer were involved in. You really need to be aware of that in order to even begin to understand the movie or the book. So I think talking about that is great. And I also think that one of the great things to talk about when talking about Story of O is the fact that the story of the writing of the novel itself is just as interesting as the book itself. The documentary, The Writer of O, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about, is just fascinating. Dominique Aury was an absolutely fascinating woman. I'll just give just a tiny bit of background. I don't want to overdo it. So Dominique Aury, born Anne Desclos, so she had two pseudonyms basically. The book was published under the name Pauline Réage, but she was known professionally as Dominique Aury. She was born in 1907. So this book was written in 1951, although it wasn't published until 1954. She was almost 40 when she wrote this book. And the sort of genesis behind the book, she worked for a publishing firm. She was incredibly well educated. She worked for Gallimard, which is one of the most famous, prestigious to this day French publishing houses. And so she worked for them as an editor and a translator. And so her biggest book was like this, I think she'd edited a book of 17th or 18th century like religious poetry. And she was very like prim and proper in her like physical presentation. She was like exactly not the person you would have thought would have written this novel. Much like Catherine Robbe-Grillet being the writer of Jean de Burgh, which we'll get to. But anyway, so she wrote this book almost on a dare. Her lover was another Gallimard employee, Jean Paulhan, who's a very well-respected publisher and French intellectual and had written and published many things himself. And he was married. And so she was much younger and they were having an affair. And she was getting older and she was starting to feel he had a kind of a roving eye. She was worried about, I'm going to lose him. And she was very much in love with him. This was like the biggest love of her life. She stayed with him until he died in the late 60s. And so in 1951, they were talking about de Sade. And funnily enough, Dominique Aury had not read de Sade when she wrote the story of O, which is an interesting tidbit. But anyway, they were talking about de Sade, who was being republished at the time and being talked about and was like newly discovered around that time as a sort of cultural talking point. And he said that women could never write like de Sade. And she scratched her chin and went, "Oh, really? You really don't think so?" And this is also really described, her writing process is really well described in the essay that precedes the sequel to the book, which is A Girl in Love. And she describes the whole writing process. And she went home and every night she would get out her papers and pencil and like scribble the text. And then the next day she called Paulhan and said, "I've written something for you." And she gave it to him. And he was immediately like, he loved it. He thought it was wonderful, wonderfully written. Not just, "Oh, wow, this is titillating." This is well written and you should keep going. So he encouraged her to keep going until she'd basically produced like 5 parts of text. Some people have in the past theorized, because we didn't know who Pauline Réage really was until I think it was finally revealed in around 1984 in an article that it was in fact a woman. It was like hotly debated. Like at the time it was published, it could be this famous person, it could be this famous person. It was,
and everybody thought it was Paulhan for a long time.
Everybody thought it was Paulhan, yeah, who also wrote a very interesting foreword to the book, yeah. Acted as like a sort of representative for Réage in her sort of press and later like sort of police interactions, because the book did eventually get into trouble. They took it to Gallimard, which obviously was their employer, although Gallimard didn't know that. And they said, "No, we're not touching this." And so Paulhan took it to Jean-Jacques Prouvaire, who was basically the one who was publishing de Sade and like becoming a younger publisher on the scene, publishing things like de Sade and controversial things, and was like, again, like a cultural talking point. And he was like all over it. And also he claims to have known all along that it was Dominique Aury. I knew from the first time I picked up the text that it was Aury. But anyway, so he published it and it was like a non-event when it got published. Like it was a very small edition. The press really hadn't picked up on it until it won a prestigious literary prize, the De Magot, which is like a prize for up-and-coming writers. Then it was like the press caught attention and was like, "Oh, who is this woman writing this salacious book? We need to know who this is." And then Paulhan comes out and goes, "Oh, no, we're protecting her anonymity." And then the more sort of traction that the book gained, that's when it caught the attention of the censors, who did some investigating. And basically, like, they talked to Paulhan, they talked to Prouvaire. And finally, they talked to Réage herself, Dominique Aury herself. And even though it wasn't explicitly revealed to them that this was the author, I think there was a sort of, based on what I've read of the story, there was an understanding that they knew that this was her. And like, she was so prim and proper and a lady, if you will. Eventually, it just got dropped. And I think for a long time, it was banned to minors. But it was still available to buy. It wasn't full. They decided not to ban it. So all the charges and stuff were dropped.
And meanwhile, all of us first encounter it as we're minors.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. I know, right? I'm sure she would have wanted that. But yeah, so that's the genesis of the book. And it's also important to know that it was not her idea to publish this as a book. This was like just for Jean Paul, and this is just for his eyes only. That's why she'd written it. But he was the one who encouraged her to, like I said, not only continue writing, but to ultimately publish it. So, and because I know this is a controversial book, I know it's a controversial movie, I know there are issues talked about and things talked about in the book that even now people just don't, it's just still too much for some people. And I get that. It remains like a really interesting subject to talk about. And there's been some great debates and some amazing women that have written about this book in the past 75 or so years that it's been available. So it has an amazing literary history. And I'll just add, I think I mentioned this to Sam earlier, but I had the great privilege of being able to yesterday see the original manuscript for this book, which is held in Harvard's archives. So I made an appointment. When I found out, I was like, whoa, I made an appointment over there to go look at it. So I've actually seen like these handwritten pages that she...
So crazy.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And when you're right in the thick of reading and thinking a lot about this, it's like, it's a very intimate experience to sit there with her handwritten pages and be like, wow, this is, and you picture her like sitting there on her bed at night, living in her parents' house, writing this book.
It's like going to pervert Mecca.
Yeah, and it sure is.
You ever been to pervert Mecca?
You ever been to pussy heaven?
Not yet, but now that I know it's just a few hours drive north at Harvard.
When you say that there are things that are too much for people, what kind of things are you thinking of? Like thematic or what?
The sexual content for sure. So there's I guess a couple things. And I also want to say that I am approaching this conversation about this book and this film from just a literary and a film criticism standpoint. I'm not a member of the BDSM community. I'm not speaking in any way to the authenticity of the relationships or what's presented and the way it's presented in the text in the film. I just want to put that out there that I'm just approaching it from a textual standpoint.
It does not feel like a safe, sane, and consensual relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to avoid making any claims that she gave her consent and that's that. And issues of consent are big. Yes, and she's asked at many points, and this is where the film actually is pretty faithful to the text. It's faithful in a lot of ways, not every way, but a lot of ways. It does seem to replicate this idea of consent and the importance of, and O is asked at almost every opportunity, you can say no at any point to this. You can stop this. You can say it's over. And she always declines. She always says no. And one could wonder, yes, she's being asked, but is she giving consent freely? And that's probably a fairly, I would dare to say, sort of modern interpretation of those situations.
Also of character. When you're talking about, can a literary character give consent? It's like the answer is no. This is not a person. Like, we're not watching a documentary. And I do think it's important to stress that, especially to younger listeners who, like you said, I think people don't always approach this kind of subject matter that's maybe more transgressive or more nuanced as this is just a book or this is just a movie and this is not meant to be a document about an actual relationship or even about BDSM relationships or the whole scene. You really have to go in knowing some of the context here, knowing that it was written by a woman, but also knowing that this is a literary work by a highly educated person in a literary field. It's not the same thing as like the Emmanuel book.
Right, which was inspired apparently by Emmanuel Arsène reading this book, Wendelino. But no, I totally agree. This kind of relates to the Susan Sontag essay, The Pornographic Imagination, where she debates how she differentiates pornography, and which I think is a fascinating essay. And if whoever's listening and is interested in reading about intellectual debates about this, I highly recommend that essay in particular. She really tries to make the distinction that I think exactly what you're arguing.
But I think that's also what makes it murky to talk about. And not to speak for you, but when Mike asked, like, what do you think is too difficult? I think it's that those issues of how real does it feel? What is it meant to represent? Is this really consent? is this just a romanticized view of this type of misogyny, this abusive relationship? And so I think to me, like reading it and watching the film doesn't feel nearly as complicated as talking about it does, especially for contemporary audiences. Like, I think talking about this in the 90s or hearing people talk about it, especially once everybody realized, oh, this actually is written by a woman, I think the conversations are just about different things than when you talk about it now. But I don't know. The movie really emphasizes this particular part of the novel where even though she is a submissive, often in some very extreme ways, you do get the sense, or at least I get the sense, that she is giving consent and making her own decisions. And I think it would be a very different story if she was with the same man the whole time. But this idea of her switching from René to Sir Stefan and also using a pseudonym the way that Pauline Réage did, it feels like she's going on this kind of Alice in Wonderland type journey into this whole other dimension, which of course comes up, it's referenced, she talks about it in the film. But it feels like she's going on this journey and she doesn't necessarily want to be in control of the journey. She wants to go where it takes her and she wants to see how it changes her. And I just really love these kinds of female journeys of sexual discovery, often through transgressive sexuality, of which there are not nearly enough. Like, definitely The Image is another great example. And she does enough to de-eroticize some of the degrading sex scenes that I think that also makes it feel maybe less misogynistic. I don't know if you guys would agree.
That can be a big argument against the sort of misogynistic intent. I think there's a few things that are important to think about when thinking about what, whether this is misogynistic and how to approach the text. Number one, just going back again to the author, this is a female fantasy born out of a female brain. Dominique Aury identified as a feminist. She stated that clearly. So that's not something that's even up for debate. She considered herself to be feminist. And if you read interviews with her, she's had very progressive views on things.
Also bisexual.
Also bisexual. Yes. And outspokenly so. The counterpoint to that is you could argue she wrote this for a man. Therefore, is it not then becoming basically, or to please a man even, do we then argue that it becomes a male fantasy? I think about that, and I've read Andrea Dworkin's essay on this and, her thoughts. And
sorry, vomit sounds into the microphone.
Just to say that I've tried to read various viewpoints and just try to understand, because I'm so fascinated by arguments about it. And I think it's so reductive to see it as just a male fantasy.
That in and of itself, is misogynistic. You're basically saying this woman, just because she happens to be in love with a man, is somehow not capable of having her own agency because of that perceived heterosexual relationship. It's crazy.
She may have written it for Pauline, but I think he edited maybe one word of the text. So it's not like she gave it to him, he fully rewrote it or told her what she should and shouldn't do. I think he had made a few very minor comments. But other than that, it is fully Dominique Aury, Pauline Réage's text. Pauvert, when he received it to publish, didn't want to change a word of it. I think the only thing they did, and this will probably emerge later when we talk about the films, was that the final chapter, which later became Return to Roissy, which became a separate book, was initially the last chapter. And I think it was decided we should end it the way the book originally ends, which is the end of the sort of the owl party commander scene, which is an ending to really make you think. And then obviously in the book, there's here are two things that could have happened. And I think I read from Dominique Aury, who basically says that this was from an interview with the person in 1984 who interviewed her. When I asked Aury about these endings, she shrugged, quote, "I didn't know how to end it, so I left it open. Why not?" So much like the beginning of, and just to go back to the sort of the construction of the text, so much like the beginning of the novel where you have these sort of two beginnings where it could have started like this, it could have started like this, which I think is a fascinating literary device, first of all.
I also love that it's in the film too.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. The fact that I think Jaeckin, the screenwriter, had the foresight to go, you know what, this is really interesting and we're going to keep it, is great. So similarly with the ending, there's two possible endings. One is that she goes back to Roissy, which, you know, was where the second book came from. And then the second ending. So it's the ambiguity, I think, that's important and interesting. And again, makes this a work of literature, an important work of literature that we should still be discussing. It's not pulp for titillation purposes. It's so well written. I think it's beautiful. And maybe as a teenager, it may be harder to parse some of this, but when she starts to talk about relationships between the character, and particularly O's past and her relationship with, especially women specifically, the character development and the way she talks through O's psychology is just so fascinating to me. And we know some of that comes from Dominique herself, because some of these characters are taken, she has said, are taken from her past. Jaeckin was a girl she had a crush on in school, and René was someone who broke her heart at some point.
And I think Anne-Marie too, right? Somebody she had a relationship with, I think.
She was a writer too, Edith Thomas, but I think she was French, so it was Edith Thomas. But yeah, who was also an intellectual and a writer, and was her she had a relationship with. But yeah, that was Anne-Marie. Yeah, so a lot of these things, these characters come out of her own life, even though they're like quite changed. Funnily enough, Sir Stefan was more of like just a fleeting impression rather than someone she knew, which was apparently she and Pola went to a bar in Paris and just saw this Englishman sitting at the bar, and she was just so struck by him as just a physical person that he became Sir Stefan because she was convinced he was an Englishman drinking his whiskey or something.
But it's incredible that Pauline didn't inspire Sir Stefan.
He's probably there somewhere. And I think just the fact that it's an older man, it's almost impossible, just in the same way that it's impossible not to read into the symbolism of O, which, again, just to go back to the author, like she has claimed that O is simply, it's short for Odile. It's, again, also inspired by a character from her past. And that's the only reason why it's called O. I think it's too hard. It's too easy to take that and interpret that in different ways. And I think similarly, it's too hard, knowing her relationship with Pauline, to not see elements of that in their relationship.
I was always told that she was called O, not because it was a nickname, but because of the way that she has to keep her mouth open and her legs open the whole time, and that it basically represented that. And then somebody else was like, no, actually it's because she's nothing and is a big zero. And I was like, oh, interesting. I don't necessarily agree with that, but just the way too that she's kind of thrown away at the end of the story. One of those two endings is like, oh, Sir Stefan broke her heart and she asked for permission to kill herself and he gave it. And then boom, the book's over. I was like, oh, fuck, that's a dark ending.
Aury is on the record as having said in an interview in the 70s that she, in a great book, by the way, an interview she did with another intellectual called Regine Desforges. It's Confessions of O in English. But it's like it's a book-long interview that Regine Desforges did with Dominique Aury, who is then still not revealed. She's still just called Pauline Réage. I believe it's in that interview that she is asked directly about what's the symbolism of O. And she says, I did not intend it to symbolize anything, which I think is just so like absurd because it's open for interpretation.
That kind of makes it better in a way. It almost reminds me of when somebody asks, there's that famous interview where somebody asks David Lynch to explain the symbolism behind something, and he just looks at the camera and goes, no.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe she just refused to.
And I think being that literary and being an editor by trade with that level of education, she had to know that there was going to be so much you could read into that name. But I think it's better to go into it as a writer without a clear intention about what does the O mean. So I feel like it allows you to think about it in so many different contexts.
So many times I was looking up this movie and I kept getting that version of Othello that was just called O. And I was like, no, different movie. Very different O. Yeah, it's not Ophelia. It's not Otello. It's definitely just O. Thank you very much. When it comes to the writing style, I don't know if this is exemplary of something that I've been critiqued for before, whereas the difference between erotica and pornography, and I don't know what that difference is. I don't know if it's that old, I'll know it when I see it kind of thing, but I would think that this leans more into erotica than porn.
I don't love that people try to make this distinction at all because I think it's unnecessarily reductive and allows you to write certain things off and put them in boxes. But for the purposes of this conversation, reading something like Story of O, where the author had a clear intent besides trying to sell some cheap erotica just for people to get off on, it makes me think a little bit of some of the more downbeat 70s hardcore films where you're watching something that feels like a real affecting film with a lot of emotional resonance that clearly someone like Gerard Damiano with like Story of Joanna, he's not making that just so people in the cheap grindhouse theater can jerk off. There's more to it than that. But I think if you're talking about written erotica, whether that's pornography or not, I think a lot of it is in the intent. It's, are you trying to just make a cheap buck and maybe you don't have too much else to say? Someone, perhaps not me, but someone could make a case separating those two, like literary erotica and porn. But I think here there's no debate whatsoever because she was writing it as this kind of literary exercise, also as a love letter. This, to me, is as far from pornography as you can get while also including a lot of sexual content, if that makes sense.
And as far as the movie goes, Jessica, you called it softcore, and it definitely feels like that. There's a lot of boobs, a whole lot of boobs, and so much of this, I didn't realize that Jaeckin had also done Perils of Gwendolen, which I was like, oh, cool. When I was a younger man, I was just like, oh, cool. Tawny Katane in a sexy movie. I can't wait to see this. And it was just like boobs, 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 boobs.
Do you have a problem with boobs, Mike? Because that's what I'm hearing right now.
I have no problem with boobs, but it's just interesting to watch this movie, and just so much of it is like beautiful women with their boobs showing in the outfits that they wear, and like, oh, they can pull up their dresses and have easy access and stuff. If you had not told me that this was a woman that had written this story originally, I would have been like, oh, this is a young man's fantasy just to see boobs, because boobs were all, I'm in my teens, boobs, boobs, boobs. I want to see more boobs.
And I'm sure that's why people can continue to dismiss this film, and because they haven't read it and don't know that, in fact, the costumes that are represented in the Chateau, if you've read the book and you know the details, like they're very good and accurate representations of the way they're described in the book. And Réage studied costume history and did a lot of work to create those costumes in the work of literature. And I just think Jaeckin does such an amazing job of, or the costume designer was Tan Giudicelli, I think. I think they're incredible. I could talk for a long time about all the fashion in this film because it's one of my favorite things about it.
And the owl mask.
And the owl. Yeah, we got to talk about Leonore Feeney because I think she's important to this.
But I feel like the distinction here also with all the topless nudity has to be made that, A, this is a French film, so topless nudity way less shocking than, say, an American film like this. Also a French film in the 70s, right after the Emmanuel boom, when audiences just wanted as much nudity as they could get, especially during that period in the 70s when the tax laws were more lenient and the censorship laws had just been dropped. So we're definitely at peak naked breast cinema and where softcore movies are concerned.
And I think it's pretty obvious why the producers decided on Jaeckin to direct this. There were a number of directors who wanted to film this for a long time, and there's any number of reasons for why it took so long for it to get a film adaptation. Number one being, I guess, the breaking down of boundaries and censorship in what you could show in film. And obviously like Emmanuel was like a big taboo breaker in that respect.
Last Tango also.
And again, as exactly as Sam is pointing out, we're in France, we're on the cusp of X films becoming full hardcore films becoming legal. They were shown in separate theaters, but they were legal. And again, and in the States as well, obviously, you see with things like Deep Throat, things were starting to be porn, nudity, hardcore was all becoming like much more mainstream in cinemas. It was part of a zeitgeist, I think, in that way, and that it was capitalizing on these newfound lack of, or softening at least of censorship, and also audience interest in seeing more and wanting, this movie showed me this. What do you got for me in this one? We got some S&M. It's, again, and another reason why all this is so interesting to talk about, because then it leans into the sort of political specter in France and things that were going on at the time there. And I think that's why you began to see this proliferation, erotic novels. And we know this like with slightly earlier with Jess Franco and his de Sade adaptations. People were just starting to like really develop an appetite for this. And as more and more was being allowed, I think it was a combination of directors wanting to do it and then an audience interest, just like it built to this crescendo.
Oh, yeah. And I think things start to get really dark by the mid 70s. My go-to year that I usually talk about is 1976, when you have all these like really sexually downbeat movies coming, I think, as a inevitable kind of cultural backlash to something like The Summer of Love. But I feel like you can see this as being on the pathway to that, because it is darker. It does present these really unconventional relationships. Even for a film like, comparing it to Emmanuel, she's definitely going on a journey of sexual awakening that also takes her into more unconventional relationships. There are some queer themes. But here, I think because she's basically going to S&M finishing school and is sacrificing so much of her conventional life as a working photographer and maybe a more regular person. Like, to me, Emmanuel feels more like a rich person fantasy, where she's married to this ambassador, she's living in an exotic place, and doesn't have what would look on paper to many people a regular life. And not necessarily that O does either, but more so, like, she's presented as this kind of bohemian artist photographer. Once we see her in the film, once we see her in her day-to-day life, she does feel a little bit more grounded and like less of a fluffy fantasy than something like Emmanuel.
I'm reminded of someone's remark on a Letterboxd review where someone was like, oh, she went to Roissy on her PCO. Just like, oh yeah, I took my 2 weeks summer holiday. Well, yeah, I'm back at work.
That is how it feels. She went to pervert summer camp.
They drop you right into the middle of the story, kind of. I mean, we talked about those two different beginnings, but we don't know anything about O. We don't know anything about René before we really start the story. So yeah, maybe she has a job, maybe she doesn't. We don't know until, gosh, what, half an hour?
Yeah, almost halfway, I think.
We start off with, René is in a suit and she's in a dress and they're picked up by a car, but if memory serves, it's a little bit of an older model of a car. And when they get to Roissy, they're dressed in very older type clothes. I mean, it feels more like we're going back to like peasant times with some of these. And the only thing that really seems markedly different between the book and the movie is the Jean Gavin character, Pierre, who's in the book, but I don't think she has a love affair with Pierre. He's more just like a minder and definitely not nearly as handsome as Jean Gavin, who's got a great look to him. I think I've only seen him in one other film in my life, and Hope to Die. And he was fantastic in that and just made such an impression when he showed up in this. I was like, oh, I must have seen this guy 100 times. But looking through his filmography, I'm like, I don't think so. I think I've just seen him in one other movie. And when she's done with Roissy, gets back into a car, and then we see, her apartment. We see, or I think it's René's apartment maybe. And just like, oh, it's modern times. It almost feels like a shock for me.
You're catapulted right into the 70s with the photo shoot. There's no question of what time this is. Like when you get there, it's like the movie starts and they're in a park. I mean, yes, their clothing is very like indicative of the 70s. You get that. An old school Rolls Royce pulls up and you're like, there's like a sort of, again, the ambiguity of time. I think the novel, I think, does this a lot as well. And then like suddenly you're catapulted to Roissy and you're like, you're in full in like the Gothic castle trope. You're there, like it's dungeons and women are wearing these costumes where there's corsets and there are chains. And one of the things I really love about both the book and the movie is that you have a loss of a sense of time. I think that's why it was probably easy for Jaeckin to, because obviously the book was written in the 50s. You could just as easily put this in the 70s when you're outside of Roissy, it's like the same, it functions the same way. Funnily enough, if you read, just to briefly digress from the film and the book, Guido Crepax, who is an Italian comic artist who's fantastic. He adapted many books and many erotic classics as graphic novels, and Story of O is one of them, and I highly recommend checking it out if you have any interest in this stuff. But he sets it in the 20s, because obviously if you know anything about Valentina and the sort of the world of Guido Crepax, he's obsessed with Louise Brooks. So if you look at the graphic novel, it's all set in the 20s. Everyone has like 20s clothes and 20s haircuts. It's like quite an amusingly different adaptation of the sort of sense of timelessness, the openness to interpretation.
They both make sense, especially looking back historically. The 20s and the 70s as being these eras of more debauchery and more sexual permissiveness. I think it would be weird to see this in, say, like the 40s or something. But that Crepax version is so good. Also, highly recommend.
Yeah, I was just looking at my bookshelf because I'm like, don't I have that? I think I might own that because I love his work. I think he's a fantastic illustrator. I love his stuff.
This again goes back to like what I brought up earlier, is the influence that this book has on artists. There's some sort of like back and forth borrowing. Like if you're looking at an artist, like I mentioned, Leonore Feeney. So she was a surrealist artist. There's a lot of dialogue with surrealist artists in this novel who like fully embraced it, like right off the bat as a classic. So Leonore Feeney was a surrealist artist who she took these photos and did these paintings of these owl masks. She like collected these owl masks and took these amazing photos, or had these amazing photos of herself taken. And Dominique Aury had seen these photos, and so then included the scenes with the owl mask. She admits this was an influence, and she apologizes. She's like, I'm sorry to Leonore Feeney because I stole this from her. And then later on, in later editions of the Story of O, Leonore Feeney did illustrations for the book. So it's like this sort of dialogue. Hans Bellmer, the surrealist artist, did a illustration for the frontispiece of one of the first editions for the book. Again, like other artists have adapted it freely and it just embraced it as a text that really speaks to the surrealist aesthetic. So I think that's really important, is not only was it a book that was talked about and highly regarded and debated, but also it like went on to be a huge influence on other art forms. I just think that's amazing.
I also have to wonder if she knew of the surrealist and like Rothschild famous costume parties, because the ending scene definitely gives me that vibe where people are stepping out of their day-to-day lives to go to these lavish villas and castles to have these costume parties, where I think the implication is that there are a lot of substances being imbibed and people getting up to maybe not sadomasochism in quite the same way as the ending of Story of O, but you can really feel the cultural influence on her being a product of that time and place. And in a lot of ways, even if she didn't originally intend to publish it, writing this when she did, when it was, like you said, around that period where Sade was becoming a little bit more known or a little bit more prominent, especially in literary and artistic circles. Like the surrealists in the 30s and especially the 40s were just all over his work. So to have her come a few years after that, it's like, of course, they're going to love this novel.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that maybe something that, like I don't think was quite the same in the US at this time as it was in France, is that publishing figures were basically celebrities, like the intelligentsia. So people like Pauline and Pauvert and Dominique Aury herself, I wouldn't say she was famous. Like a lot of these literary publishing figures and people who wrote like essays and things like that were just as famous as like artists or actors, or even maybe even more so. They were just like, their opinions were highly respected. Like they were considered like the people, even people like Alain Rombrier, like he was among de Mandiargue, like all these people were like this sort of the pillar of intellectual society in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And now we have YouTube.
What does Logan Paul have to say about this?
But I feel like Sontag, who you mentioned, was maybe the last major American version of that, where it just seems like such a different world when intellectuals were on nighttime debate shows more than celebrities, or just as often as celebrities, because they had celebrity of their own. Take us back.
I want to talk a little bit more about the movie and some of the striking images that are in here, because I think Jaeckin does a fantastic job when it comes to capturing a lot of this, especially the cinematography around the Roissy part, and just that it's like honey-colored film. You know, just everything seems so warm, and maybe that warmth makes it feel a little bit more safe than if this was shot in a colder way. It feels like there's, I don't know, something smeared on the lens type of thing, but you just feel like this almost, you're mentioning how this is playing out like fantasy, and there's mention of, Alice in Wonderland, and it feels like this dream, especially when she's in Roissy. Things are of a different color palette. And then when she leaves there and goes back into the real world, I mean, I was talking about what a shock it is, especially the stark white of a lot of the furniture that's in the apartment, and just seeing real daylight that isn't kind of filtered through. Like, I love the scene when the Jean Gavin character takes her down these stone stairs into this little area where he whips her, and it's like the sun is above. It's almost like they're in a cave, and then you get that stark contrast with quote unquote the real world that she's in. But then you get some striking images, like after the photo shoot, she's got the Jacqueline's picture projected onto a wall, and then she's got what looks like a mock-up for a magazine cover, and she's adjusting it to put her face onto the magazine cover, and then also like lovingly caressing the face and putting her lips next to Jacqueline's lips. And I'm just like, these are great images. I think that this is shot really well.
I think personally that's where the film really succeeds. The photography, and I think the cinematographer for this is someone who ended up who also worked on Emmanuel. I don't think he was the primary cinematographer, but I think he worked on it. And then he went on to work with Jaeckin like all through the 70s. Like he was like, became his go-to guy. And I think it's the sort of communication of, and the sort of harmony of the cinematography, the art direction, and the lighting. It's just everything like works together perfectly. Like it's just, they all seem to understand each other. They all seem to understand like what Jaeckin wanted to show. And Jaeckin was a photographer as well. He had an eye for this kind of thing. By the way, I think it's funny, Jaeckin was one of these people who went on to be a filmmaker, but initially started like learning photography during the war, like during his war service, much like Radley Metzger and Russ Meyer, which I think is funny.
And Jean Roland to a degree.
And Jean Roland, yeah. So it's just always funny to remember that that's where some of this training comes from, is like military service. But anyway, Jaeckin did a lot of fashion photography, and you can see it. He has an incredible eye for composition that he's able to communicate. And then you see this in Emmanuel too. It's, again, why these movies are why we still look at these movies, why people who write fashion blogs still talk about these movies, just are interested in beautiful images. Like people who just stumble across these images and go, I don't know what this is. This happens to me a lot when I like post about movies on my Instagram page. People are like, what is this? Where can I see it? These are amazing images. And I'm just like, I know, right? Here's where you can see that. I think this definitely speaks to like the lasting power of the film. I think if it didn't have such striking imagery, it might not have retained the audience that it has, I think, today. And the story of O was showing on Criterion Channel earlier this year. I could barely believe my eyes. I was like, really? Amazing. In their like fashion photographer, like films grouping or whatever. I was like, okay, that's an interesting way to drop the same.
It does make sense, though. I feel like you do get a number of erotic, especially softcore films in the 70s that has that kind of crossover where it's like we're here just to look at naked women in beautiful settings and the plot is maybe secondary, which I don't think is the case with Story of O, but he's very much making the most of these visual worlds. And I think the contrast to them is so important, especially at reflecting her character development and just like the way that when she comes back from being at Roissy in the first act of the film, it seems like every time she returns from one of these sadomasochistic secluded places, these like fantasy places, she comes back as this like more confident version of herself. And when she first gets to that apartment, it almost seems like she doesn't feel like she belongs there, doesn't feel comfortable until she starts doing her work as a photographer. That's one of the things that really sets this apart for me is the way that she has her own career as a creative person that gets a decent amount of screen time, but also how he folds, probably unintentionally, how he folds his career as a fashion photographer into the visual world of the film. And even though I do maybe have some issues with the script, it's like I have no issues with how it looks and how seriously he seemed to take the visual world as an important component of the character herself. It's really wonderful.
I don't remember the exact language around when she does come back from Roissy and begins to work again, but I want to say that Réage described her as being more masculine. Is that right?
I want to say she starts wearing more masculine clothes when she comes back, when she's working. Like, she's more dominant to the other female models working with her. And I love how we see her kind of transform in these female dominated spaces, especially when she goes to Anne Marie's house and it's all women, and how that kind of compares and contrasts to her photo shoots where it's pretty much all women.
I think also that this speaks a lot to Corinne Cléry's performance as O, because I think she's really wonderful. And this is her first big film. And she's like a model before this, and she had one small part in a movie. But the way that she reenacts O's transformation is really good. And again, going back to that scene that Sam was just talking about, where she's, and especially that, like in the movie, you get this a lot, I think, and why Jaeckin definitely understood the text is she's really directing the models with this sort of like this force and this strength. And Cléry just really, you really feel that sort of first degree of transformation that she goes through. And I just think it's great. I think she was so great in this.
Yeah, she is so striking and just does such a good job with such a challenging role, especially because she has to portray all of these emotions plus all of the things that are going through her mind as she's undergoing some very intense whipping and punishments and all of these things. So to be able to bring all of that to it, and it's great. She's still working today. I think she's the only person from this film that's still around today.
And Udo, of course.
Yeah, well, pump the brakes.
Oh, sorry. Just an editing note, this was recorded before the recent passing of Udo Kier. The thing that I dislike about...
Is that you can't believe that he's straight? Yeah, me neither.
I hate that he's dubbed in French. I'm just like, come on, no, I love Udo's voice.
Wait till you see the English dub.
The English dub is grim.
Give me him either speaking English, which I love his delivery in English, or speaking German. I want to hear that. But yeah, it's a shame that we're robbed of his voice. And I'm so curious, Jessica, as far as when they showed this on Criterion. I don't know if you had a chance to watch it, but I'm curious about which version it was, because watching the Blu-ray that I ended up picking up was so confusing at first, not knowing that there were different cuts of this, and the way that they cut them back together with the English dub and the French dub, and some things are have subtitles, some things don't, and I just kept trying to figure out, what did they censor? Why are these scenes that are suddenly showing up in French? Why are they in French versus, why was this cut versus the other stuff? Because I couldn't see, like, was it a particular character? Was it the lesbianism? Like, what was the reason for cutting these particular scenes? That was so odd to me.
Yeah, I didn't. Unfortunately, I didn't get to catch it well. It was very briefly. It was only like for like a month or two. So I can't say that I saw that version, but I could only speculate that maybe someone somewhere is trying to create some kind of integral version. Obviously, this had a DVD, and obviously it came out on Blu-ray in I think a couple countries. I think there's a German edition, and I'm not sure what edition you were telling me that you had, Mike, but I think like maybe 2 or 3 different countries had Blu-rays, and I only have the DVD, so I haven't really explored like what subsequent editions have come out of this, but why someone hasn't picked it up. And it's his 50th anniversary this year. Like I'm shocked as to why somebody didn't pick it up this year and go, hey, Criterion did, I guess you could argue in its own way, if it doesn't actually have a physical release. But I'm perplexed as to why this hasn't been given a high profile home video release with some kind of integral version. I'm actually thinking back to something like La Marge, where you have these like different versions with different endings, and putting together an integral version is difficult because you don't know, which was the director's cut, as it were.
The version that I ended up buying and taking that audio commentary from was one called Bounty Classics Collection. So everybody's familiar with the Bounty Classics label.
Best
correct?
label around.
100%.
Yeah, I love it. I signed up for their subscription model, so I get updates never. That's the version. It almost looks like it's Australian, just with the censorship label that's on it.
Yeah, I think there was in Australia because I tried to dig a little deeper and find out like what its current home video situation is. There's an Australian edition. Like I said, there's a German edition that's like kind of deluxe. Like it comes as like a cool box set with like a mask and like some kind of collar situation.
Incredible. And of course the Germans.
I know, right? Like how did I miss that? And then I can't maybe a Spanish Blu-ray, which is weird.
Yeah, I wonder if the German version is the composite. So the composite version must have some sort of weird rights issue because the composite version is streaming. My guess is the reason that the version that you watched that has mostly the English dubbing, and there are those scenes in French, my assumption is that those scenes were cut out of the English version, not because there was content that had to be censored, but because they were like, this movie's long as fuck. What can we trim from it?
Yeah, I can't remember what the running times are on these different versions.
I think the full version isn't like around an hour 45, but most of those scenes that were cut out are scenes in her apartment where she and René are talking about how he's going to give her to Sir Stephen, and Sir Stephen now owns her, and I think also trying to convince her to bring Jaeckin into the fold. So they must have just went, are there sequences where there's not a lot of nudity? Maybe we can trim that. Because it
sounds accurate.
Yeah, but it seems crazy to me that those would be cut for any kind of content or censorship issues. It also makes me think a lot about the early Tenebrae composite version, which in my late teens, buying that on DVD, I was so confused when they just randomly started speaking Italian and was trying to figure out like, oh, is this part of the plot? Is he's just slipping into Italian because he's in Rome? But the scenes there that are cut out of the English dub, it's the same thing. It's like characters having side conversations that someone decided could be trimmed. So I assume that's also what's happening here.
The English dub runs about just 90 minutes or maybe just over 90 minutes, something like that. It's definitely not an hour and 45. So that's, yeah.
So they trimmed like 10 or so minutes.
All of what you're saying, it's things that were in the book and are actually important to the story, but someone just went, this is just talking, and cut it out.
Yeah, someone who thought of it as just a titillating softcore movie was like, we don't need to have all this conversation about ownership.
Yeah, when in fact, like that's one of the most important parts
of the main
book,
plot.
Yeah.
Talked a lot about, is this a man's fantasy? Is it a woman's fantasy? And was she writing this for a man? And, we talked a lot about consent and stuff, but the interesting part of this book and movie for me is that she recognizes this in herself. You know, she calls herself a bird of prey at one point, and then when she wears the owl mask, you know, several chapters later, I was like, okay, that fits. And she's at that point where she's wearing the owl mask, it's, I am bringing Jaeckin to Roissy so that René can have her or something. And I don't know, because I don't think she's interested in René whatsoever. René seems like the biggest loser of the story, which is my other objection, because why are you going to go with Sir Stefan when you have Udo Kier right there?
I know, right? Definitely, as you say, like trading down. Fascinating tidbit that I did not know until very recently is Christopher Lee was the first choice for Sir Stefan. Can you imagine?
That would make so much more sense. We basically got him in Jess Franco's Sod adaptation, although he was clutching his pearls apparently afterwards. So I can't imagine him really going through with playing that character, but you at least have to get someone who's, even if it was like Oliver Reed, can you even imagine? It has to be someone who is a superior choice over Udo Kier.
Anthony Steele, bless him, just does not have the gravitas that you need to really carry that character. He's just like, he's clearly like the second, I don't know if other actors were considered, but he was definitely like clearly not the first choice. And it's definitely a failing of the movie, is like not a strong, because he's such a pillar of the novel. Like it's, you just need someone incredibly commanding to be in that role.
In the novel, he's written so convincingly. Like, I remember my impression reading it at first was, how dare her boyfriend think that he's just going to hand her off? But then the more time you spend with his character, you're like, oh yeah, he's the superior choice. And I think something that the film tries to do, and there is a little bit of dialogue about it, is this idea that she recognizes that he's also in love with Sir Stefan and is using her as a way to impress Sir Stefan. And so, not that he doesn't have genuine feelings for her, there's no genuine relationship there at some point, but it's clear that he is also subservient in a way.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of suggestion that there's a, despite the fact that they're, I think, half brothers in the book and step brothers in the movie, to make it a little more distant, but there are some homoerotic overtones. There's definitely a suggestion of some kind of relationship. And in this interview with Regine Deforge, when she was asked about the relationship between René and Sir Stefan, she said it's more of a hero worship situation, as she put it. She said she didn't intend for them to be involved in any kind of a sexual relationship, but that it's exactly as you say. It's like the younger one trying to impress the more sort of domineering older one. So that seems to be what it is.
Well, like, of all the different readings of the film, I mean, you can read this as, you know, misogyny or women's liberation or just as a BDSM treatise. But one of the more interesting ones I was reading was more of like a Marxist take on this, and especially just the use of humans as chattel, basically. This whole idea of like, well, here you go, Sir Stefan, here's this woman that I'm handing over to you. And then René's like, well, I want this Jaeckin, so I need you to go get her and take her to Roissy so that she can be mine, and just like trading lives kind of thing. And that's, I was going to say before, is the whole idea of like her being this predator with Jaeckin. A lot of it is, in the book at least, like, oh, I find her very attractive, I would really like her to be my lover. But then after a while, she's just like, she's so full of herself, I'm never going to get through to this woman. Like, I went away to Anne-Marie's place, I'm coming back, I'm covered in welts and all these things. Nobody's, you know, she's not noticing until like the newly installed chains on her, what they keep calling it, something interesting. They call it her womb in the book, which I found interesting. I'm like, I think your womb's a little bit higher.
The very first translation of it I read, they would call it her belly.
Yeah, belly. Yeah. Again, it's Aury's like sort of refusal to use the C word, or she's just for whatever reason just does not want to I guess I don't necessarily want to say it's being vulgar because I think that's for people. It's nothing wrong with using those words. It's just that's just a sort of a style, if you will, that she just chooses not to use. So she uses like womb and belly and like more sort of soft, less direct language or just sex.
Could you imagine Christopher Lee saying that he wants her to rouge the tips of your breasts?
I would pay big money for it.
Because there's no nipples in the book. It's all tips of your breasts. So I'm like, oh, okay. Jaeckin will not even pay attention to her until the chains that are coming off of her womb or belly clank against the bathtub. And then she's like, oh, what is that? You know, and it's like, you're just not paying attention. You're so full of yourself. And it almost feels like O is punishing her by selling her out. And she recognizes that she's almost this Judas goat to Jaeckin.
The movie sort of makes this a little bit clearer than the book does, is like O's jealousy of Jaeckin. And even when she gets to a point, I think this scene doesn't happen until they're in the movie, they're in Brittany, but in the book, they're in the south of France where they're going to visit the commander. They're all like sitting around and O has this catharsis by which she goes just like, she realizes that like Sir Stefan gives her all that she's looking for in this type of relationship, and that René is just she's almost like, oh, how could I have ever thought that René would be the one? But yet she says that, and yet she's still jealous, extremely jealous and bitter about the fact that René has fallen in love with Jaeckin, even if it's unreciprocated.
The relationships, and I think they do a pretty good job of showing this in the film. I feel like the relationships get so much more complicated in the second half in a way that further de-eroticizes the story, where you just realize this isn't some lofty fantasy about some woman who goes to S&M training school. It is so much more about the intricacies of those relationships and how she really comes to lose her romantic fantasy of René because she realizes how much of a little bitch he is.
I could be abusing this term, but it feels so like Jane Austen, where it's like, well, this person loves this person, but this person really loves this person, and this person wants this. But then you add BDSM into it.
Basically, yes.
I never not want to see Udo in a film, but I almost wish someone else had been cast in this role because I feel like I don't want it because this character is so just, I don't want to look at Udo Kier and just be like, wow, what a weakling. Jaeckin doesn't even love him. And he's just lost. Is just, I'd almost rather see someone more, an actor that I don't like in that role in a way, because I just find the character like ultimately so distasteful.
And I feel like Udo can be really great at playing, especially in the 70s and early 80s, playing these kinds of distasteful characters who are distasteful because they're perverse or they're duplicitous, sneaky. He plays a similar type in Fassbinder's Bullwieser, or the station master's wife, where he plays this like bisexual hairdresser who's just like really squirrely and seduces the wife. And he's a despicable character, but you love him. Whereas here, it's almost like a version of the Italian Inetto character, where it's like he's just passive to the point that makes you hate him.
Everyone's doing the things. Oh, Sir Stefan told me to say to Roissy. Okay, I guess I'll do it. Oh, he wants to be his own. Oh, okay. Oh, but I love Jaeckin, but I can't get her because she doesn't love me. Oh, will you take her to Roissy for me?
You do it for me.
God damn it. Just stand up and act like a man.
It is still nice to see Udo on camera.
No,
though.
I'm never going to complain about it. And I love him in those like amazing 70s suits. I honestly cannot believe that people complain about the fashion in this. They're like, oh, the men's fashion is terrible. I'm like, no, all of the fashion in this movie is literally great. Those are like Cerruti 1881 suits, and they're incredible. They're like, suits are not tailored like that anymore. Like they look incredible.
He's also one of those men still to this day who looks always incredible in a well-tailored suit. And so it's like, even if his character's being a douchebag, at least you have the pleasure of looking at him.
I can't say enough how much I actually appreciate the adaptation of this. I feel that they give us just enough of everything. It doesn't feel like they skip the wrong things, that they glom onto the wrong things. I mentioned the Jean Gavin part. I feel like it's appropriate. And I like that he comes back later on in the story and it becomes this whole like, do I have permission to sleep with this guy or not? Like, how much agency does she have? Because the one thing that we forget when it comes to like BDSM relationships, yes, this is a 24/7 relationship, so it's a little bit different. But like when you are scening with somebody, like the submissive usually is the one with the actual power, no matter how many whips and riding crops and all these things that the dominant has. The submissive, as long as you're playing correctly, has that safe word and can always stop the scene whenever he or she wishes. So it's like, it's different than topping from the bottom where it's just like, oh yeah, well I need this and I need this and I want you to hit me 27 times on the right breast and only 25 on the left, those kind of things. That's obnoxious. But when it comes to having your safe word, that is that consent. That is that I can stop this whenever it needs to be stopped.
Yeah, and I think that's why it was important for us to stress at the beginning of the episode that this is not meant to be any kind of realistic portrayal of BDSM culture, because she never has a safe word and there's never any discussion of what her fantasies are, what she wants. But I do think you get a really strong sense from the beginning of the novel that does, I think, translate to the film. This idea that for her, there's this sense of absolute freedom in this total oblivion that she gets by giving up her control and seeing how far her own limits can be pushed.
One slight failing of the movie, I feel, is that we don't get the sense that we do in the book that O is from the beginning on a path towards self-annihilation. And this ties into a lot of other complicated things about the novel. I mentioned before the author had edited volumes of religious poetry. There's a lot of Catholicism and martyrdom and religious like undertones in this that are very important and don't for whatever reason don't quite come across in the book or the movie. I'm sorry, and that's fine. I don't think you need that in order to tell the story the way it's told in the movie. But I think the fact that basically the way the novel ends, or at least one sort of intended ending of the film, is just the complete destruction of O, and that's whether it's we see her downfall after going back to Roissy, or we see her take her own life after she's abandoned by Sir Stefan. Even the ending that we do get in the book, which is basically it's just like this sort of climax of she's completely transformed into this object that she's not even human. All these people are at this party. She's got this mask on with her piercings and her brandings, and she's naked wearing this cape. She's not even human anymore. She's just stared at like an object. She's like completely, her humanity is like dissolved in a way. And I think in some way the author does imply that's a path that she's set herself on and is devoting herself to in doing all of these things. And I guess maybe that was just too complicated of a theme for the novel, or too dark, because it's incredibly dark, isn't it? And that's maybe we can talk about the ending of the film versus how it ends versus the book. And I have mixed feelings about it. And I don't know. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think.
I also do wonder if those themes around religious martyrdom and shame, like in the beginning of the book, there's a lot of effort put into showing how much shame she feels around doing some of the things René asks her to do. Like even that opening scene when she's sitting in the back of the car and he asks her basically to take off her stockings and her underwear and put her bare ass on the seat, which, as you see in the movie, becomes this kind of recurring, very nice, like quick little visual symbol. But when she does it in the book, it takes a lot longer than it does in the movie, because she's, wait, you want me to do what? Like, I cannot possibly do that.
Yeah, shame is the word occurs a lot in the book. There's a lot of descriptions throughout the book, of even well into the book, where she talks about, because it's the book is written in the third person. This is like another sort of, but clearly the book is written from the perspective of O, even if it's not first person narration. So it's like we're inside her head. We're privy to the way she talks about how she feels shame when Sir Stefan and René are describing her in coarse terms, or she's asked to do something incredibly degrading, or at Roissy. It comes up a lot, actually.
She does feel this shame at first, And then there are two very distinct moments towards the end of the book where she goes to get waxed and she says, like, I knew this was the last time I would ever be in this salon because they were completely disgusted with me, basically. And she doesn't care. And then same thing when she goes to the party where she's got the owl mask on. She says at one point, like, this American, oh my God, Americans are so coarse, but this American grabs her and grabs the flesh and the chain. And when he realizes that she's chained, he gets disgusted by that. She says, like, he sobered up immediately, this drunk American. And I was like, oh, interesting. And again, she's proud. She's very proud now of the chains, of the branding, of all those things. She no longer feels that shame.
Yeah, we definitely do get to a point where, and it's made pretty explicit in the movie as well, as she felt pride at, like, we are aware of her sense of pride, of her sort of the final phase of her transformation, if you will, and the journey that she's been on. And she does finally come to a place where she stops. And I wish I could pinpoint the exact moment where it was. Maybe it's the moment you're describing, where she just ceases to be an emotion she experiences in her journey.
Well, so much, I think, when it comes to, like, taking the pain and everything, it's that, how much can I take? You know, how much of this am I going to be able to withstand? And then feeling that pride of, like, I was able to take more than that, and just pushing yourself. So when she does come back from those things, like going to Anne Marie's, like going to Roissy, she feels that pride. She is changed. She does feel more confident because it's like, this is the person I'm becoming. Cléry
does a good job of portraying that pride in a kind of fairly subtle way. I feel like it's a kind of a glint in her eye. I have to just point out that when I see these montages of training or her having to go through ordeals, and it's presented in almost like a dare I say, I'm reminded of the South Park, they call it a montage, like a sports training. You just want to hear, like, the Rocky music or something behind it. It feels something about it just like in the back of my head. It's just like the whole montage convention. And maybe there's no other way to do it, but I'm not sure. I can't really help but overlook the sort of silliness of the montage here. But anyway, to the point, she gets to the end of these, like, montage sequences she has, like, this look in her eye of, again, like a saintly martyrdom look, but also like a glint in the eye of, I did it. And she says there's points at which she'll say to René, I did it. Like, I coach, I made it through. It's she's able to have those moments of satisfaction and having made it through this ordeal that she sacrificed herself to.
But I think without the shame, or without the sheer amount of the shame that's in the book being in the film, I don't think the ending could go as dark. And so it makes sense that it's softened. I haven't read Return to the Chateau or Return to Roissy. How does that ending? Because I know that they make mention in the Story of O book. She says something like there's a suppressed chapter to this. And then she talks about the two different potential endings. With Return to the Chateau, like, how does that end? Is this whole thing of the branding of Sir Stephen, is that part of it? I honestly don't remember.
I know it's been a really long time since I've read it too, so I have forgotten a little bit.
It's been like 15 years probably since I've read it.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no audio book version of that one because I listened to the Story of O book over the last week, which...
Wow, there's an audiobook version?
Wow, that's amazing. Who is it? Please tell me someone good reads it.
I don't remember the woman's name, but it's nobody that you would know. It's not like Kathleen Turner reads Story of O or something.
What I recall of Return to Roissy is just basically that it's what it's meant to do is to portray a sort of gradual breakdown of O. And once you've reached this sort of pinnacle of submission, where do you go from there? It's like you either die or you return to Roissy. And they're the character in the novel that carries over into the Return to Roissy that is the little sister of Jaeckin. She's called Natalie. And she appears in scenes at the end of the book, but she doesn't appear in the film. She's like subsumed into other characters like Jaeckin herself and Nora. But she's basically like the little sister of Jaeckin, and she wants to be like taken to Roissy. And that part of it that's maybe O's impetus for her return to Roissy. And then I just think she has some kind of, like I said, I can't really remember like what exactly happens, but she just descends into like prostitution, and I think she starts like doing these sexual acts for money, and then it becomes cheaper, and just, I think it just, this sort of perfect world of submission that she felt she had achieved just starts to deteriorate. And
does she become a secret agent, perhaps?
So there is something about that, isn't there?
Oh, is there? Because I was joking
no.
around because of one of the sequels that we'll talk about after the jump.
Maybe because I had read something about something that happens in the sequels, but for some reason that I don't know why, but that rang a bell with me.
Yeah, I just remember it getting really dark.
Yeah.
But like in a different way. It's like she's definitely trying to do something different with the second book.
They just felt it went in a different direction, they being Pauline and Pauvert, and that's why they said maybe we should not publish this chapter. Exactly, split it off, yeah. So that's often published with, again, this essay that I was talking about called A Girl in Love. The two are typically, especially in English, I think, I'm not sure about the French, but those two are usually published together, and that it did not appear until I think like 1969 or something like that, because the first part, A Girl in Love, like basically like she wrote that about her experience of writing the story of O. She basically wrote that while she was like at Pauline's deathbed. He was dying in hospital, and she was just like writing this as like remembering how she came to write the novel. Again, which is why I think that piece of the book is like incredibly important, that essay. And it's so worth reading for anyone that is interested in the backstory of the creation and the writing of the story of O.
Just for posterity, it's Kathy Mazur, Mazur, is the one who read the book. And she's mostly known as an actress. She's only read a handful of books as far as I can see. And she was in Major Crimes for quite a few years, it looks like. Yeah, so we should talk about the end of the film, which does obviously differ from this. And I was kind of surprised when the film ended the way that it did. I thought there would be more to this. I think it's kind of an interesting ending that, so she, like we're saying, she's going on this journey of discovery, and one of the major parts of the book is you are going to go visit this woman, Anne-Marie, and she's going to get you ready for having chains put on your womb, as well as being branded. And so that becomes a major part of the book. And then we have the whole idea of her seducing Jaeckin, trying to get Jaeckin to go to Roissy as well. And then really it ends, the book, for me, primarily ends with the party scene and her in this owl mask. But then that's where the book and the movie kind of veer off from each other, is right towards the end of this.
Yeah, and the end of the party scene is a bit different from the way it takes place in the book too, because one sort of recurring conversation that Sir Stefan and O have about their relationship is, he says, I've never, shared you with another man while in my presence. We see him ultimately he lets another man have sex with her at a restaurant or something. And then was it his son? I can never remember. Or some younger character takes her back to his hotel and has some sort of like sexual awakening with her, and then wants to marry her, and we see how that all falls apart
and she says hard pass.
Yeah, she goes, you know what, tie me up, spread me open, and then invite this kid over. We'll see how he does with that. And the kid's like, oh, I'm out of here, bye.
Yeah, exactly. But it's that Sir Stefan has left the room, like when it's not done in his presence. So like in the book, the last scene, he and this commander character are both like having sex with her, and that's how the book ends. I can't remember if it's talked about in the first book or if it gets talked about later in the second book, where Sir Stefan like begins to have this sort of disillusionment with her after he shares her with another man. They have a threesome, or she has sex with other men in his presence, and for some reason that diminishes her in his eyes. Like whereas in the film, I don't think that's as much sort of importance is placed on that. Although we do see Stefan leave the restaurant at that point, so it's referred to, but we don't get that same ending of the book as we do in the movie, or at least in that final party scene. I guess I should say that scene doesn't end the same way. And then there's the tacked on happy ending as where they're. So I think that's like I feel like the major diversion that the film takes. And as Sam was saying, like, I feel like it makes some sense in the context of the film and what the film is trying to do. But I think for fans of the book, it's pretty much a slap in the face, I think, to the people who love the book, because again, we're going back to this journey towards annihilation. And that's like a total 180. It's, oh no, she's happy. She's in his arms. And she even convinces him to go through some of the things that she had to go through. And it's just this sort of happy consensual relationship. And that's, I think, and I do wonder, I have to say, I tried to find out if it's written anywhere what Dominique Aury thought of the film, and I couldn't find her if she saw it, if there was she had a reaction to it, and what she would have thought about that ending. I'm very curious, but I wasn't able to find anything.
Yeah, it's a very like heteronormative tacked on ending where it's like now our relationship can be balanced and consensual because we're both going through the torture. Like, you miss the whole point.
Yeah.
Yeah. To end it with the shot of the mark that she gives to him, and then her ring with the ringlet basically on it, and one on one side of the screen, one on the other, fade out, and then credits. I was like, really? That's how we're going to do this? Oh, okay.
The ring, by the way, is a lot different. And the ring became, I think, a popular thing because of the movie. I think that there was a trend for that ring for a while, but the ring in the movie is like a lot different from the way the ring is described in the book. Just for what it's worth, just details I noticed. Like it's described as like having like a Triskelion like spiral situation, and it's like gold with steel plating or something like that. So the way the ring is shown in the film, which is more like almost like a collar with like a sort of a ring attached, almost like a ring attached to a collar, but fashioned as a ring to wear on one's finger.
It is a pretty cool ring, though.
It is a cool ring. I can see why it caught on, totally. I didn't recall noticing, like, oh yeah, the ring actually is not as it's described in the book, so that's another difference. But yeah, it's just like hint of S&M that I think was like kind of people caught on as like a kind of chic fashion accessory, though.
That Triskelion has kind of morphed into more of a symbol of BDSM overall, where it's like people will use that, or it almost looks like the Tao, the yin yang symbol, but with three things going around rather than being this balance of two. It's more of the three. So yeah, still used today. All right, let's go ahead and take a break. First up, we're going to hear from director Pola Rapaport about her 2004 documentary, Writer of O. After that, we will hear from Maya Gallus about her 1997 documentary, Erotica, A Journey Into Female Sexuality, which features the last interview with Dominique Aury. And we'll be back with both of those right after these brief messages.
Let me ask you a question. Are you getting enough? I bet you'd love more, right? Well, adamandeve.com wants to give you more, with 10 free gifts. First, you'll get a sexy surprise for her. Second, a specially selected toy for him. And third, a little something we know you'll both enjoy. Plus, you'll get 6 full-length adult movies on DVD. And number 10, free shipping on your entire order. So what do you have to do to get your 10 free gifts? It's not hard. Just go to adamandeve.com and select any one item. It could be an adventurous new toy, sexy piece of lingerie, or anything you desire. Just enter offer code BOOTH at checkout, and you'll get all 10 free gifts. Go check out adamandeve.com today. Select one item and get 10 free gifts, including free shipping when you enter offer code BOOTH. That's BOOTH at adamandeve.com.
Looking for something superior to streaming? A place with more than 5 times the selection available on all streaming services combined? Check out Scarecrow Video's Rent by Mail service. Select from an unparalleled collection of over 150,000 films and get Blu-rays, 4Ks, and DVDs delivered directly to your door. Get in on it now at scarecrow.com and rediscover the wonders of physical media. welcome to the interview portion of the show. First up, we're going to hear from Pola Rapaport. She is the writer-director of Writer of O from 2004. Can you tell me a little bit about you and how you got involved in filmmaking?
My parents are responsible. They named me after a silent screen star, Pola Negri, and my middle name is from Garance and Children of Paradise. They met in Paris. She was American, he was Romanian, French. And my sister, who's older than I, she had two names from literature, and she became a writer, and I became a filmmaker. And then they took us to a lot of great European films when we were kids, very young. It was cheaper than babysitting at the time. We saw so many wonderful French and Swedish and Italian films. And I just loved movies. I think both my parents did, and we were very lucky growing up. We came to New York when I was 5, and there were so many movie theaters around the city at the time. Then in my high school, I went to a high school that was just for girls at the time in New York, Hunter High School, and they instituted in our junior year a film appreciation class, which was fantastic. So I think I saw my second Fellini. There were 3 teachers, and they all brought in different things that interested them in terms of social and cultural and art and so on. And then in senior year, they brought in a filmmaker who had gotten a grant from New York City. He offered a filmmaking class, and so only 3 of us signed up, I and my 2 best friends. And we made a little film that was very cute and Super 8. And then that summer, at the end of my senior year in high school, Young Filmmakers was a group that had free workshops for high school students. And one of my friends and I took that 16 millimeter workshop and made our first short films in 16. And then when I went to sign up for NYU, Haig Manoogian was my teacher and the head of the department. And he said, "You've made a 16 millimeter film, so we're going to put you in second year." So it was a culture shock because suddenly there were boys in my class, young men that were a lot older than me. But I was a very tough girl. So tough in the sense of nobody's going to tell me to shut up, sort of thing. So anyway, I made a bunch of films then, which some were good, some were not. And then continued and then just kept on somehow. I tell you, sometimes I wonder how I've kept on so long doing film because it's just become more and more expensive. But I've had a couple of incredible advantages. One is in 1988, I met Wolfgang Held, who I started living with and married a few years later. And he is an incredible cinematographer. He's a member of the American Society, the ASC, American Society of Cinematographers. And he's shot most of my films since then. And so we have a very good rapport, And then in around 1999, I found out that my Romanian father had a son before he met my mom in Paris. And this came out of the blue. So I wanted to do a film on this person, this new half-brother called Family Secret. And for the first time, I got funding from French television, Arte. And that kind of changed my life because it wasn't much funding. I didn't get paid for the year, but at least I didn't have to sink all my money into it. And the film was very well received. So then Arte and other producers there ended up commissioning 4 or 5 more films, and one of which was Writer of O, Écrivain d'O in France. Yeah, so that's where the funding came from. And it probably had the highest budget of anything that I have done until this time because it had a lot of fiction sequences and we had some really wonderful support in Paris.
Before this project came up, what was your history with the story of O?
My older sister was very sophisticated, and she read about this very forbidden novel in Newsweek magazine. I think it was Newsweek, which my parents used to get. And then my parents spoke French in the house between them, not to us. And my dad in particular, who was a psychiatrist, was very into French culture. My mother was very into international art culture. My mother was very not into any kind of eroticism, pornography, or anything like that. But my father was a little more open-minded, and my sister insisted that Daddy buy this book, which was available in the Grove Press edition translation. You cannot say no to her. So he bought the book, and I'm sure he was quite interested also. And it was in the house, So I was like, hello, boating, something like that. So I read like little sections, and I thought it was just like you'd touch the book. It was like your hands got burned practically. But I didn't read the whole thing. And I had no idea who Pauline Réage was, and nobody else did either in the whole world, except for a few people at Gallimard. The author, the purported author, it was a pseudonym. And then many years later, long after my dad died, anyway, we had this book on the shelf, and it's a very simple cover. It's a white cover, and it just says Story of O. It's like very minimal, no images whatsoever, which I think was fantastic marketing on the part of Barney Ross at Grove Press, the English edition. But then I met a woman, a German woman, Monica High, through a work connection. My husband's German, and we did a location scouting job for her. And she said to me, she knew my films and she knew Wolfgang's work, his camera work. She said, I met this fellow. I would love for you to meet him. He discovered who the real author of Story of O is. And my ears really perked up because as far as I knew, no one knew who Pauline Réage really was. She said, yes, I was on holiday in Ibiza. It wasn't Ibiza. It was another island in the Balearic Islands. And this British journalist, John de Saint-Georges, was in a house nearby, and we started talking. And he was working on a book about the Olympia Press in France and an article for the New Yorker that was a reduced version of the book that told this mystery of who this person was, because a lot of people thought Pauline Réage was really a man. So John knew this person. And so she gave me John de Saint-Georges' number. It turns out he was living in Rhode Island. I called him, and he said, yes, I've met her. She's 86. She's a literary critic for Gallimard, partly retired now. And he gave me the contact of a very mild-mannered lady named Dominique Aury. That was also not her real name. And I knew that if I wanted to do this film, that John de Saint-Georges, first of all, I needed permission from him because he wrote the article, and he was a key character in this whole multi-decade drama, like 40-year drama of the incredible kind of underground success of this book and the question about who the real author was. And he believed that he had found the real author. And when he described her to me, I thought, this is just like too good to be believed. She's petite. She's very delicate in size. I saw a photograph. He had one photo of her in his, when I went and looked up the New Yorker article, which somehow I had missed. Stupid me. But there was the article with this photo of Dominique Aury and John's research in the New Yorker. Then I went to Paris. I used to go a lot, but I hadn't gone for several years. And it was March of 97, was it? Yeah, I think it was March 1997. I stayed with a dear friend, my friend Jaeckin Deighan. And from Jaeckin's house, they used to have something called the Minitel in France that was like a precursor to the internet. This is pre-internet, or internet was happening, but I didn't have access. So on the Minitel, I looked up the name Dominique Aury, and I think there were 4 listings. And it turns out that 2 of them were actually the Dominique Aury that I was looking for. But Dominique could be a man or a woman, right? Which is one reason she picked that first name. And one of them was in a little town, maybe 20 miles south of Paris. And one was in Malakoff, which was just a little suburb on the edge of Paris. So I figured, let me call the one in Malakoff. And I called, and this voice picked up, the voice of an old lady, an elderly lady. And I said, is this Dominique Aury? In French, I talked to her, and she said yes. And I said, is this the author, Dominique Aury? And she said, yes. I told her who I was, and I said, I'm a great admirer of your book, Histoire d'eau, and I am thinking of doing a film about it, a documentary, because it's such an interesting story. Might it be possible while I'm in Paris to come and meet you? And she said, oh, of course, come by on Sunday. We'd love to see you. And she told me where she was located, which was not Malakoff. That was her Paris house. She was actually in this other little village, Boissy-la-Bertrand. And so my friend Jaeckin, from where I was calling, was very interested. She said, this is incredible. She also was completely not into erotic literature, but she loved the mystery of it. So she drove me there. And on the way, I picked up flowers and petit four. And Jaeckin and I went, and she had been somehow keeping secret for 40 years. She gave the interview to John about a few years prior, and no one was bothering her. She was quite elderly at the time. And her son, she had a son when she was around 20, and he was a very odd fellow, Philippe d'Argila. He was in the house, sick upstairs with the flu or something, but his wife, in other words, Dominique's daughter-in-law, Pete was her name. When did you last meet a woman named Pete? I never did. Anyway, so Pete was this Dutch woman who was down at the kitchen table working on, I don't know. The reason I'm telling you all this, it was just the whole experience was so fantastic. So this Pete character is sitting there working on like fixing leather goods or like these delicate leather goods or something like that. Very masculine kind of woman. And then out comes Dominique, this tiny little woman. She must have been like 4'10" or something. And John had warned me that she was losing her memory, which happens to many people. She was 89 at the time. I believe she was 89. And he's warned me, you may have trouble with your conversation with her because there's a lot of stuff. Her immediate memory it's like someone with senility. And I believe Dominique was suffering from a degree of senility, but she was an extremely brilliant person. This happens to a lot of really young people. So Jaeckin was with me. We went out in the garden. Jaeckin took a couple of photos of Dominique and me in the garden. So I have proof that we were there. Then we went in, and Dominique sat down on this kind of day bed, like this thing, but without a backing. And she just sat there ready to be interviewed. And did I record it? No, I did not record it. There wasn't an easy way to record in those days, and I hadn't even gone to France with a tape recorder. Forget about filming. So I just interviewed her and took some notes, and she did not, when I raised she was very interested in this book that had just been published because she was a very important editor at Gallimard, which is the biggest publishing company in France. And there had just been a book published called Anthology of French Poetry that she was the anthologist of. She had gathered poetry from way back into the 16th century and all this. And she autographed 2 copies, one for me, one for my friend Jaeckin. And that was all she wanted to talk about. And from time to time, I would say, I'm quite curious about the film, about the book Histoire d'eau. And she just skated over it, she didn't respond. I think I raised it twice or maybe 3 times. So she loved the flowers. She loved the petit four. It was a very, very nice afternoon. And finally we took our leave. And when Jaeckin and I got back in her car, I turned to her, I said, so is she the author of Story of O or isn't she? It was like, we knew she was from what John had said, but she wouldn't talk about it. So peculiar. But I was 99% sure that she was. And then many things happened after that. I called Philippe d'Argila, her son, from New York. He was not nice. And he was quite interested in the idea of me doing a documentary, and he wanted $100,000 or something like that. He took so much money from his mother over the years. He practically made her broke because she didn't have a very good deal from her publisher, Jean-Jacques Pauvert, but she did have 10%, and this book sold a lot of copies. But Philippe was just like sucking money from his mother, this guy. He was now, if she was 86, he was like 66 at the time. And so he thought he was going to get money out of me. I didn't have any. So I said, gee, Philippe, I'm sorry. I really want to do the film, but generally documentaries don't work this way. You don't usually pay. Sometimes you pay for the rights to quote sections from the book, but generally you don't pay for the right to interview someone. And so I think he started to realize that he was not going to get lots of money out of me. In the meantime, I contacted a producer that I'd heard about in Paris, and she said she wanted to take on the project. My contact at Arte, Nathalie Verdier, was interested, and that was key, because if there's a TV station interested, then producers in France can get funding from the state. So this producer was interested, and somehow after like several months, it completely fell apart. And she just, and I thought, oh, shit. In the meantime, Dominique died at 90. And actually, Dominique died, I think, before. Oh, I know what happened, Mike. I had met her. I had a couple of slightly out of focus photos of her. I had the knowledge of John's work. But then she died. I'm like, how am I going to make this movie? So then when we made Family Secret, it won a big award, the Prix de la Scam in France. And the person at Arte said, what do you want to do next? And I said, actually, I met this incredible woman, Dominique Aury. She's passed away, but I'd love to do a film that unmasks her authorship of Histoire d'O, Story of O. John's article is in the New Yorker is actually called The Unmasking of O. And the person that I was talking to, the producer, thought, great idea. But then it was like, where's the footage of Dominique Aury? So then I started researching what exists. And I found some incredible archive footage of Dominique. Very important was a 2-hour interview on film she had done with a French producer. But she said to him, he was fairly well known. He was the head of that organization that gave my film the big award. And she said to the producer, you can do this interview. It was all about her career vis-a-vis books in France, because she'd also been on TV talking about all kinds of literature in France. But she said, I will only talk about Histoire d'O if you promise that this footage will never be seen until after my death. And he agreed to that. And in fact, none of the interview, this 2-hour interview, had ever been seen publicly. Guy Seligman was the producer. He had it. I called him up. I said, I'm the one that made that film you gave the award to. I hear you have this interview, because a colleague of hers at Gallimard that had set it up told me about it. And I got it. And I remember getting that footage. It was like 3/4-inch video or something. Being in a production facility where there was a tape player, putting it on, fast forwarding or playing through the whole thing. And finally I got to the footage about Story of O. I said, oh my God, this is like priceless. I was jumping up and down in my seat. She was so wonderful. She talked about it a lot. And it was that interview, when I met her, she was 89 or 90. That interview had been done when she was 86 and she was 100% coherent. It was like precious. Oh my God, it was so great. And I thought, okay, Guy Seligman we'll negotiate with him. We'll get the rights to this. And we did. And then I found a couple of other interviews with her. That producer that had been involved and dropped the project hooked me up with what turned out to be the best possible people in Paris. It's called INA, the Institut National de l'Audiovisuel. It's a government agency that is basically the French television archive. And they have some money. They tend to be very stodgy, but this project was not stodgy. And they took over the project from the producer that had dropped it, and they were fantastic colleagues because they had archived themselves. They dealt with the budget. The production manager they assigned was, it was an all-woman team. It was a female producer who had incredible connections, Sylvie Cousin, female production manager, Michel Boig, who was about to retire, but they were both very into it and incredibly helpful and really good at what they did. So it turned out to be an amazing pleasure. Oh, and the lady who ran INA briefly at the time, Anne Schuschman, was very into this project too. So there were these 3 women in France. And there were some mitigating circumstances. I had to edit in Paris, which for me was like a dream come true. But it wasn't in Paris. It was in this shitty suburb where INA is located. So it was like an annoying commute. But they had the money to hire a fantastic editor who I picked someone I had known in New York. And the whole thing was like a dream come true. I got Wolfgang over from New York to be the director of photography. The rest was a French crew, an incredible dolly grip who was also like an incredible alcoholic. Like he'd show up in the morning smelling of alcohol, but he was a very good dolly grip. And Sylvie Cousin, the producer, I think is from a kind of an aristocratic family. So she doesn't act that way at all, but she knew this guy who was a count, who had a chateau on the edge of Paris in the direction of Charles de Gaulle Airport. The story takes place in Roissy, and Roissy is now the airport. Roissy barely exists as a village. They razed the village, as far as I understood, to put this massive airport, Charles de Gaulle. But that was also very interesting to me because Charles de Gaulle Airport is my entry to France every time I go. And I never knew, like, people call it Roissy. Oh, are you flying out of Orly or Roissy? And suddenly I thought, wait, Roissy is where the Chateau purportedly was. So there were all these lovely sort of poetic connections. And Sylvie knew this Count Philippe, what was his last name? I can't remember, but she knew him from her aristocratic connections. And he let us, I can't remember if he charged the budget, but he let us shoot in his chateau. And the exterior of the chateau is gorgeous. He didn't want it to be seen from the front. So we filmed the scene where the car arrives at the chateau, at the back of the chateau, which is also very grand looking. But we had access to this beautiful interior. He was so lovely. He's like a working count. He plows the fields with his workers and stuff. He's like totally down to earth. And he actually plays the chauffeur in the taxi in our fiction scene where with her lover René goes to the chateau for the first time. Philippe is the count. He turns around and he looks at them. So we used like everybody we could get our hands on. They all have some really interesting connection to the whole thing. And so we had, I think, 5 days of fiction shooting, which is very expensive, more than documentary in the budget. And because I had this idea of having a bunch of fiction scenes in the film taken from the book. And that was a very hard decision because, of course, even though I hadn't read the whole book as a 13-year-old, once we got the thing going, I read it twice through. And there's a lot in that book. And then as far as doing a film and doing fiction, you have to really pick judiciously which scenes are going to be the most important to shoot for the film and to be integrated into the documentary material, which was the archive we had of Dominique, and then many interviews with other people that knew something about this story. Because in fact, there probably were several dozen people who knew that Dominique was the actual Pauline Réage, but nobody would talk about it until this time. And some of them were dead, and some of them were old, and since then, a lot of them have died. So I'm so glad we did it then. We shot it in 2004, and then it was finished and came out in 2005, and played on Arte, and played at the Film Forum in New York, and then did a Zeitgeist, which is a fantastic distributor, which also often, it's two women at the time, now they've merged with Kino Lorber. They do take a lot of films with very challenging content, sometimes erotic and so on. And they chose to distribute the film and did a small theatrical around the US, and then it was on Sundance Channel. So the film has been seen quite widely.
Yeah, I was wondering when and how that decision to do those fiction parts came about, because that is brilliant. And I love that. And I love how beautifully shot those are.
I will tell the DP. He'll be happy to hear it. Yes, he's wonderful to work with. I'm his biggest fan. The casting was very interesting. How did it come about? It seemed to me the film needed it. The documentary part would not at all be as interesting if you don't hear the quotes from the book. And the quotes from the book had to be done. We have a French version and an English version, and there's a German version because Arte is in Germany as well. But I did the voiceover for the English version, and we got a wonderful young actress whom I knew to do the French VO. which is just reading from the book. And the book has this particular quality to it. It's, God, what did they call it over the years? It's very literary. And Dominique, or Pauline Réage, talks about some of the most outrageous sexual interactions and events in this very almost dry manner, very reserved, very elegant prose. And that had to be in the film. So if that prose, if those scenes, we had to have that voiceover, what were you going to put under it? We had to shoot the scenes. And thank God I had INA, this Institut National de l'Audiovisuel, working with me, because they agreed to put together this $500,000 budget, which is a lot for a documentary. And we the casting was incredible. We saw a lot of young women for the part of O. It wasn't a lot of running time, the scenes that were going to be shot. But some of the scenes were very challenging. She had to be willing to be nude in front of the camera. So we saw a lot of young actresses from acting schools. And Penelope Primera came from an acting school. I forgot who was helping us get the actors. I think my young associate, Esther de Beausset, was fantastic in terms of production. Anyway, we saw a bunch of actresses, some of whom were very good. Penelope I really liked. She had this kind of innocence about her that seemed just right, but she didn't know me, of course. And she was very dubious about doing it. And I remember having a talk with her. I think she was only in her maybe 22 or something. I said, I had to tell her that, or somehow connect with her in the fact that this is not at all pornography. This is female sexual fantasies that are liberating, that allow this kind of mental liberation. And even though the character of O, over the course of the book, is quite debased, she's actually the boss and she's the protagonist. And when she chooses to die at the end, it's her choice. Pauline Réage just took everything to the limit. You can read the book. It's like, how can she get more outrageous? And then she gets more outrageous, but in this elegant tone. And then death is like the final thing that O goes for, dressed in that owl mask, naked. So you can't believe it. And then meeting Dominique and knowing how mild-mannered she appeared to be, but wasn't. It just was so remarkable to see all of this kind of fire coming out of someone who was on the surface reserved. That's one of the things that I found the most wonderful about the whole experience. Because when you're dealing with something with a lot of this kind of erotic or sexual aspect, I think it's completely appropriate to be very pulled back. And she was like that. So I wanted it to be worthy of her. The reason why she couldn't let her identity be known at the time the book was published was her mother was extremely repressed sexually. The father was not. He was quite a very open-minded guy, and Dominique adored her father. But the mother would have had a meltdown if this had come out when the mother was alive, that Dominique Aury was the author of this. So she said, we've got to keep it this tiny little group. Like Jean-Jacques Pauvert didn't tell anybody. They knew he was the publisher of the book, that he would not reveal her identity. There was also the possibility of being legally prosecuted for pornography in France. So she just figured, all right, let them bandy it about and say, oh, maybe it was Camus or maybe it was this great French writer or other, and I'll just laugh in the background. And then she kept it secret so long that she never made a big press announcement or anything. But when John de Saint-Georges somehow found out, and it was through some convoluted method, and he wasn't sure either that it was she, and called her and said, oh, I want to do an interview with you as the author of Histoire d'O, she said, okay, sure, come meet me at Gallimard. Like she said to me, come meet me at my house. So she was open about it, but it had been repressed for so long.
Obviously, you had the access to that wonderful interview footage, and you talked about how some people knew, some people didn't, how many people have passed on. But when it came to finding other interview subjects, how easy or difficult was that for you?
John de Saint-Jean had to be a character in the film also, and he's a fantastic guide through the movie. He tells about discovering her. I managed to get, before he died, Barney Rossett, who was the American publisher of the book, who also it wasn't a great interview. He also seemed to be not 100% able to connect on the information about the book. He was getting a little wobbly, but he is such an incredibly important figure in American culture. I remember thinking at the time, this guy is more important to American culture than any president who has been in office over this man's 85-year life. He really changed culture in America. Simply the fact of him publishing this book, and the Grove Press and Evergreen Libraries are incredible. And he fought censorship. He really went to the carpet on these censorship laws. And he could have probably gone to prison. The courage of these people, the courage of her. So who else? Jean-Jacques Pauvert was probably 26 when he published the book in 1954, I believe it was. He was very young. He's also died in the meantime. He was so charming and delightful when we met him. My assistant, Esther de Beausset, somehow found a connection to Jean-Jacques Pauvert. And he had the spirit of a 26-year-old when we met him. He was so alive and really lovely. Another very important person who's interviewed is a writer named Régine Desforges. And Régine, who is a novelist, she's also passed away. She was a novelist in her own right, had written a book called, or published a book called Conversations with O. And I believe that was published also by Grove Press. So I'd read it in English. I speak pretty good French, but I don't read French that well. So I was reading these things in translation. So I found out about that book, and she was one of the few people who knew that Pauline Réage was Dominique Aury. But she doesn't name her in Conversations with O. But Régine knew, and she was a very good interview. She was fantastic, because the people at Gallimard who were my contacts there, it was Roger Grenier and his wife. And I believe they were the contacts to Régine Desforges at the time, when they introduced her to Dominique. And so Régine was one of the people they brought into this small inner circle of people who knew that Pauline Réage was really Dominique Aury. Jean Paulhan worked with Dominique Aury at Gallimard for many years, 20 or 30 years. They were the editors of many of the books that went through that company. He was deceased by this point. I think he'd been dead for around 20 years when I met her. But he was the guy she wrote the book for. That they were having this clandestine love affair. He was married. She had been married, but had been divorced. She was married long enough to have that son, Philippe d'Argelin, and she dumped that husband. But so I don't think she ever, in fact, I'm quite sure she never married again, but she worked with Jean Paulhan, and there were some great stills of them at Gallimard. Literature is so important in France. These people were like gods, right? In French culture, she and Jean Paulhan. And they started having this love affair. He was married to a woman who was handicapped. She had some very serious handicapping malady. So for 20 years or something, they had this love affair, and they would meet on weekends. Some of that is dramatized in the film also, their meetings, not just stuff from the book. They had this clandestine love affair, and I don't think I would have liked Jean Paulhan if I had met him. He sounded pretty sexist. I really loved her, and I loved Jean-Jacques Pauvert, but when I read his writing, it seemed a bit pompous. Whatever it was, Dominique had a real thing for this guy. And she wanted to keep him. I think she felt that maybe the love affair was losing its heat. And she decided to start writing, because she knew that he was so turned on by literature that if she wrote something fantastic and very sexy, that might keep him. And that's how she started writing the book. And after she published Histoire d'eau, there was another book published, A Girl in Love, Une Fille Amoureuse. And the return to the Chateau is really not that great, in my opinion, and I think in the opinions of a lot of people. They did it with her.
somebody, maybe the son convinced her to write it to make some more money, or Jean-Jacques Pauvert did, or someone. But the initial chapter, Une fille amoureuse, which is about her and the writing of the book and the relationship with Jean Paulin, is phenomenal. It's so great. So half the scenes we dramatized were from Histoire d'Eau, and half were from Une fille amoureuse, about this middle-aged woman and her love affair with this older man, and them meeting in hotel rooms, and how she one night decided that to keep him, she would write this erotic writing, and she wrote through the entire night in her bedroom with a little pencil and just never changing, never going back, never correcting. She wrote the whole first 80 pages that night, and that was going to be the whole thing. And that's actually the best part of the book. It's the most dreamlike, it's the most passionate, it's the most outrageous. It's not the most outrageous, but it's this strange erotic dream that you enter into. And she wrote all through the night. I can't remember now if she did the whole thing in one night, but shortly thereafter, she gave him the manuscript. She gave it to Jean Paulin. And I think they were all going off on vacation. And he read it, and he was so incredibly taken with this thing. It totally worked. He fell in love with her again through the manuscript. The story is just really great. And that manuscript is incredibly moving. I should read it again now, because there's so much of her feeling. She doesn't say her name. I'm pretty sure she doesn't say Jean Paulin's name. It's just the girl and the man. I don't know why at 45 she calls herself a girl, but it's a girl and the man and the relationship, and how this initial 70 or 80 pages did what she intended. And it's absolutely beautiful. So those scenes are dramatized. I cast another actress, Catherine Mouchet, who was much more known than Penelope, who played O. I cast this actress, Catherine Mouchet, to play Dominique Aury, and she was wonderful. And you see her alone at night with just a little lamp, writing with this little pencil, writing this erotic literature all by herself. And then there are some scenes of her with a wonderful actor, Alain Rimou, who we cast to play Jean Paulin, who I think is much nicer than Jean Paulin was. So Paulin was lucky we cast Alain Rimou. He was fantastic. And scenes of them in Paris, recreating. We got some old cars from the 50s. We had them walking a wardrobe and so on, walking along the Seine. It was really incredibly fun. And Catherine Mouchet also, the first day of shooting was a scene with Régine Deforge, where they go through the dialogue that is then in the book called Conversations with O. So there are these different levels of capturing things in a literary way, and what historically happened, and recreations, and so on. So the film is quite a mélange of fiction and documentary on many levels, yeah.
You were talking about what's outrageous, what's not. I have to ask you about the big box with all of the different dildos in there. Where did you get that prop?
It was made for the film. My assistant, Esther de Bosset, who has gone on to become a very important gallery owner, had a boyfriend at the time who was a very talented artist. And we had to use whatever connections we had for the props, the wardrobe, all the stuff. And we needed a lot of props. We needed all those sexual props, which I have to remember to tell you about too, because that was funny. But this particular thing doesn't exist. It only exists in the writing of her book, Story of O. Yves, I think, was his name. So I talked with Esther and I said, this is what I'm picturing, this wooden box where when you lift it, it's not exactly what Dominique talks or Pauline Réage talks about in the book. They're not three-dimensional. They're drawings of penises of different sizes. So it's somewhat removed from the reality of the book. And that's what I assigned him to do. When the props had to be ready, lo and behold, Yves had created, it wasn't his name. Her partner there had created this incredibly beautiful box with three-dimensional pieces. He had sculpted them. And it's actually much more impressive than what I assigned him to do. He did a fantastic job. And I'm trying to remember who has that box. We did not keep it somehow. We gave it to someone.
It's classic. But regarding all the sexual props, we needed things like handcuffs, leather, what you call it, little G-strings with zippers, like the kind of stuff you buy in erotica shops. And so I had to find out, where the hell do you get this stuff in Paris? I never was in a shop like that in my life. That's not true. My Wolfgang, my partner, went to Temple University, and his apartment was like right smack in the gay transvestite neighborhood, the transvestite prostitution neighborhood, right down from his window. So we used to hear the transvestites at night. Hey, honey, hi, darling, how you doing? Blah, blah, blah. So around the corner was an erotica shop in Philadelphia, which I had been to once. So I had been to one. But in Paris, somebody said to me, there's this neighborhood where there are all these sex shops. It's not Pigalle. And I went there, and sure enough, there are all these sex shops. But it's weird to go into one of these places as a single woman. But I had found out from the one in Philadelphia that the guy who ran that shop, when you ask him for something, he's completely matter of fact about it. There's nothing like, oh, you want a dildo? Oh, you want a whip? Oh, you want... No, he's, okay, the whip, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, maybe I'll have the same luck in this place in Paris. But Esther was supposed to meet me there on a Friday afternoon. And I called her. I said, Esther, where the heck are you? Because I didn't want to do this alone. She goes, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you, I have my riding lesson right now. So I'm like, okay. And the shoot was coming up the next week. It was like we had 3 days. So I had to go in. Sure enough, the guys were 100% matter of fact. I had a list. Okay, and I had all the translations. I need a riding crop. I need a whip. I need this leather G-string. I need various things. And they're like, okay, oh, we don't have that, but we have this. Oh, here are the handcuffs. And we used them, and we put them on a beautiful red satin background and filmed them. And it was the whole thing. It's not something I normally do, but I had to step out of the old comfort zone, and it was incredibly fun and interesting.
What was the reaction to the documentary when it came out?
It got a very good reaction in France, wonderful reviews, but it was not released theatrically in France. At the end of the editing, the people from Arte, not at the end, but halfway through, they have very strict links and programming strands. And the strand that we were doing this for is called Soirée Thema. They'd pick a theme and do a theme evening with 3 different films. And the Soirée Thema the films aren't supposed to be longer than an hour. But at the initial meeting at Arte, the big boss of my commissioning editor was there, and I said, I think we have enough here. I was totally going by the seat of my pants. I didn't know there was any footage of Dominique that exists. I said, this is going to be really important film. This has got to be feature length. Because I was thinking for the US, it has to be feature length or nobody's going to look at it. And he's, oh, yes. Oh, and Anvidere was, this is very important. Yes, this will be a feature length. Yes. But then he got kicked upstairs. So over the course of the making, he was no longer there to defend my vision of it. So the commissioning editor kept saying, Pola, you have to cut it down. You've got to cut it down. I'm like, no, Alain said it can be 80, 90 minutes. And finally, at the very end, they insisted to get an hour-long version for TV in France. But we had the budget to do the feature-length version, which is the international version, which is what Zeitgeist distributed and what was shown on Sundance Channel. So two versions exist. The producer, Sylvie Cazin, who was really such a wonderful woman, she said to me, it's going to be too hard, too emotionally ripping for you to cut this film down. It's really hard to cut a film from 90 to 64. But I had this great editor, Variety Mojinski. Sylvie said, while you do the sound mix and the color correct, let's have Variety do the cut down. These films are like your children. You don't want to cut the arm off your child. At least if somebody else does it, it doesn't hurt as much. Variety did a fantastic job. She said, don't worry, Pola, it'll be fine. And this short version's good, too. It's not as good, but meanwhile, we did a great sound mix and a beautiful color correct with these wonderful people that do the finishing for you. And we had both. And it was a success. It was beautifully received in France. Then we did not get a great review in the New York Times, which I was unhappy about. It was very interesting review, though. It was on the front page of the Arts and Leisure section because it opened at the Film Forum. It had a jump to, not Arts and Leisure, that's Sunday, but the Friday section, the entertainment section. It was very long. And the reviewer told the whole story of Pauline Réage, Dominique Aury, all this stuff that we had unearthed, along with Jean de Saint-Georges. Fascinating stuff that almost nobody knew. And then she proceeded to trash the movie. I was very unhappy with that, but because you want to get a good review in the Times, but whatever. At least from the first page, you wouldn't have known. I had a great photo, and it did quite well at Film Forum and on its theatrical. And the New Yorker did a little mention. My mother was dying at the time. She died a few weeks later, but she was alive long enough to see the little blurb in the New Yorker that the film was opening, and that was wonderful. So it played in a lot of cities around the country, and I think it's a perennial.
You talked when we were emailing about a new film that you have, a new short. Can you tell me about it?
I have two recent films. The most recent just premiered in October last month at Newport Beach Film Festival in California, and now it's just played at Doc NYC, which is the biggest documentary festival in the U.S. It's called Panoramic View. It's the portrait of an artist, Francine Tint, whom I've known for a very long time. She's now 82. She was 81 when we shot the film. She does these massive, I have several of her canvases, including one that's called Panoramic View that's 15 feet wide over my bed in the apartment here. I've done a lot of films on very strong women characters, and Francine is one. She kicks ass. She's very funny, very interesting. Totally, she has incredible integrity about her paintings, and she's been doing work in her genre for 50 years in the bedroom of her apartment at One University Place looking over Washington Square Park. So it's a portrait of this artist, similar in a way to Dominique, who is very connected to their work. And in spite of the fact, it's not a moneymaker, now she's starting to sell valuable canvases, or in the last 10 years, but it's very hard to make it as a painter. Then, and as a woman in the 70s and 80s in the abstract expressionist scene, it was really hard. So Francine has managed to persevere in spite of all of the economic pressures and keeping on. We're trying to get sales agent and distribution for Panoramic View. The other film I'd love to talk about is called Addicted to Life, which I finished about a year and a half ago, which is a feature documentary also about a very strong female character. She's a Belgian athlete, a Paralympic athlete who I heard about around 2016. And she had this incredible story. She was a wheelchair racer because she had a very unusual spinal condition that was degenerative and would eventually kill her. But she had this incredible personality. Her name was Marika Vervoort. In Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, certain countries, it's allowed to sign up for medical aid in dying. Canada as well. Certain states in the US. But in Belgium, it's relatively liberal, and you can have a doctor give you a shot. So this has been the law in Belgium since around 2002, I think. So Marika Vervoort, who had this disease, this strange spinal condition that caused wild pain, when she was around 29, she was considering suicide. It was so hard, and that she was losing her ability. She was in a wheelchair from the age of 18, I believe, but it was getting worse and worse. And then she heard about this law in Belgium, and she actually got contact with Wim Distelmans, who's a physician who managed to get this law passed. And she met with him, and he said, "You're not ready to die now, but I will be here for you when you decide it's time, and we'll do the euthanasia or the medical aid in dying." So she was 29. She lived to be 40 because it gave her such liberation of spirit. So in a sense, it's connected to Histoire d'Eau, this liberation of spirit that comes in these very excruciating circumstances. And she decided, okay, I'm not going to die from pain. I'm not going to die completely diminished. I'm going to die when I choose with the help of this doctor. I'm going to live my life to the absolute max in the meantime. So she did crazy things like bungee jumping in a wheelchair or doing indoor skydiving. She traveled to Oregon from Belgium to go visit Nike and do a talk there. It was incredible what this woman did with her physical condition. And we met her. I read about her. She gave a talk at the Rio Paralympics. She had won gold in London, and then she won 2 more medals, silver in Rio. And she gave a talk about how this permission to have medical aid in dying had changed her life for the better. And I read this. I thought, this is fantastic. You know how you're going to die, and it allows you to live so much more freely. So that film is actually, it's available on American Airlines and United Airlines. We don't have it streaming yet, but we're going to try to get it up there quite soon. It's called Addicted to Life. It's been theatrically distributed in Europe and been on TV in many places. So in Japan, so on. So that's doing relatively well, but you always want more. You always want everybody to see your movie. So we're still working on getting that one out. But I don't know, doing these films, documentaries and with fiction elements, I mean, there are certain themes like these very strong women that I tend to, and often very narcissistic. Dominique was not, but some of them are, that I kind of gravitate toward. They can be hard to work with, but they're great characters on screen. So there have been some of these themes that have carried through, like ever since I was 16, making these movies from high school. Écrivain d'eau, writer of O, was a particularly amazing adventure, I have to say.
Professor Rapaport, thank you so much for your time. This was so nice talking with you.
Very grateful that you've picked the film to put on the podcast. And it's nice. It's 20 years old now. It came out in 2005. Very happy to be talking about it again. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
All right, up next we've got Maya Gallus, who is the writer-director of the 1997 documentary Erotica, A Journey Into Female Sexuality.
You've been making films for all these years. How did you even get interested in doing it?
My primary interest was to be a writer. So then that led to journalism, that led to working in television as a researcher, and working in television then led to, visual storytelling. And this is interesting. I can combine writing and image. I then realized that I wanted to go beyond working in television and make a film. And so my first documentary brought my literary interest to the forefront. So that's really what brought me to film in some ways, is a love of literature. So my first film, as you may know, was a film about poet Elizabeth Smart. She wrote a celebrated novella called By Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept. And it was about love, about obsessive love. And she was Canadian. She had a long, long relationship with George Barker, who was a well-known British poet. They had several children together out of wedlock, as they say. And he was, sort of a notorious rogue. He had, I forget how many children, 15 children or something with different women. But Elizabeth really stuck with him because he kind of personified an image for her. And again, with her, she fell in love with him because of his language. She was in love with his poetry, and she was primarily a poet. And when I read By Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept. For me, I was drawn to it with the language. So that was my introduction to becoming a filmmaker. And after that, I thought a lot about, well, what do I want to do next? And then, of course, had read Story of O and had read Nancy Friday's books on women's sexual fantasies. And there were all these different things coming out. This was in the 90s around women and eroticism and the whole question of erotica versus pornography. And if a woman writes it, this is erotica, and a lot of feminist questions as well. So I was interested in exploring female desire and the range of female sexual expression. And that led me to meet and film with, and also interview some who weren't in the film, some really, really extraordinary women. And that led to the making of Erotica, Journey Into Female Sexuality. The women in the film ranged from Annie Sprinkle, who is this extraordinary performer, sex educator, now a filmmaker as well, who had worked in the porn industry. Candida Royale, who had worked in the porn industry and speaks in the film about her conflicted feelings about it at a certain point. And so she realized that she wanted to create erotica or pornography from a female point of view and really make these videos for women or for women and couples. And that was a big movement that was just really starting at the time. I was very drawn to many of the French women, including Alina Reyes, who is a very interesting French writer. She had written an erotic novel called The Butcher. Around that time in 94 is when The New Yorker published a piece about the story of O, the unmasking of O, because it was largely believed that the writer was a man and that a woman could never write something like that. So John de St. George met her and revealed, she was willing finally to reveal her identity. Dominique Aury, which was also actually a pseudonym, was a respected woman who had written this book in her 40s. She was an editor and writer at Gallimard, and she had this long love affair with Jean Paulhan, who was a very respected editor, many years senior to her. He was still married, so they had a clandestine affair. At a certain point, she was afraid that she would be abandoned, that he was losing interest. So she wanted to entice him with her stories, and much like Scheherazade, she wove these tales to draw him in, drew on her own fantasies to a degree, but really on what she knew would appeal to him in terms of his fantasies. I had the extraordinary experience of meeting her first for the research and then filming with her. And my film Erotica has the final interview with Dominique Aury. She was 90 years old. And it was really quite an extraordinary experience meeting her. And I don't know what I expected. I didn't have specific expectations because all of the women were so very different. But she was very modest, lived in a very Spartan, monastic kind of environment. And she was just very clear who she was. At one point, I asked her, I think I started the question with, do you think women are capable of? And she stopped me and said, women are capable of anything. And I just found her so interesting and was very fortunate and grateful to be able to have the last interview with her. And then several years later, Pola Rapaport was making a film called Writer of O. I believe she had met her, but was unable to film an interview with Pauline Réage, so she contacted us and said, can I use some of the excerpts from your film in my film? So the interview that you see with Pauline Réage in Pola's film is actually, those are clips from Erotica.
Tell me more about Aury as a person. What was she like? You said she's demure almost, but very sure of herself.
Dominique Aury was a very elegant woman, very simply dressed, and very direct, and had a serenity about her. We were an all-female crew. We were just all had that sense of being in the presence of someone who really knew who she was, had no ego, very generous, very graceful person, and such a beautiful writer. And she was very much a writer. So she really did approach the story of Or Histoire d'Eau from that place. And she was very open in speaking about her childhood, her relationship with Pauline, her mother who had a lot of shame around sexuality. And so I think that was also motivating her to go in a different direction. It was actually one of my memorable experiences in filmmaking. One of the privileges of being a documentary filmmaker is to be able to be invited into someone else's life, even if for a short time, and sometimes to be able to peek behind the curtain and see and experience things that other people wouldn't be able to. And that certainly the experience with Dominique Aury was one of those experiences.
Was she hesitant at all to talk with you?
No, because the piece in the New Yorker came about because, well, you probably know this, but John de Saint-Georges was writing a book called On the Good Ship Venus about Gallimard Press. And so he didn't know when he was working on that book initially that she was the writer who had written Story of, but she was an editor at Gallimard. So as a result of that, I wrote to John de Saint-Georges and said, I'm making this film. How can I contact her? And he said, contact her, which I did. They put me in touch with her. This was only my second film, so I was still pretty fresh. I went to Paris to research and meet several of the women. I rented a car and was driving out to where she lived in this very small village. It seems every time one goes to France, there's a strike. So, of course, there was a strike going on. I remember I phoned her and said, okay, I'm going to come and meet. At first, I'd written a letter and she was very gracious and said, yes, come at 1:00. So I get in the car and I'm driving. It was chaos. The traffic was insane because of the strike and people were literally driving on the sidewalks. Fine. It's, I'll go for it. So I'm driving. I get onto the périphérique, which is the circle around Paris, and I'm looking for the exit. 3 hours later, I had come back to exactly where I'd started. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. And this was well before cell phones and everything. So then I had to drive back into the city, find a payphone. I phoned her. I was almost crying. And I said, I'm so sorry. I'm going to be very late. And I thought, oh, please don't cancel the interview. This is so important. She said, that's okay. Come when you can. So I got back on the périphérique, tried to stay really focused, found the exit, found her village, really. And it was all very kind of confusing in terms of, turn left at such and such a building. So I pulled up at some sort of a store and said to the gentleman in France that I was looking for, Dominique Aury, and he gave me a certain little smile because I think he was accustomed to these young women coming and to, pay pilgrimage to the writer of Histoire d'Eau. And he gave me directions, and I showed up, and there she was, and she was just very relaxed, very lovely. And then we went back a year later with the crew, and it was a very similar experience.
A year between?
I'd have to look at the exact dates, but that's pretty common with film. A film is, if you're lucky, made over a period of 3 years. The research is usually in the first year, and then the filming in the second, and the editing in the third. That doesn't always happen. It can come together more quickly, or it can take much, much longer. And when I was making my first film, I remember meeting with a mentor who I had asked if he would help mentor me with the film. And he said, well, this is going to take you at least 3 years. And I thought, no way, it's not going to take 3 years. And of course, got 2, 3 years later. That is quite typical. I do remember it was April when we filmed in Paris, and we started filming first in New York, then San Francisco, then we went to Paris. It might have been maybe not quite a year because it was, I think, fall, early days of winter when I went to Paris before. So, but certainly it was the next year, but not necessarily exactly a year.
You touched a little bit about your crew. Can you tell me a little bit more about them?
It was important for me to have an all-female crew because of the subject matter and the approach, and it really did make a difference. It was at a time when there were a lot of feminist discussions around the beginnings of discussions around what is a female gaze and how is a female gaze perhaps different than a male gaze, which is the male gaze is what we, of course, were familiar with as the predominant voice in literature and film and art. I was coming from that place of looking at things from a female perspective and exploration. And I wanted to have an all-female crew so that there would be a feeling of comfort level for the women, of which for some that wouldn't have mattered, but for many it did actually make a difference. It created a very intimate environment. And there was just this feeling of, well, intimacy is the only way I can describe it, which was very important to the film because it was a very intimate film, and I wanted people to feel that intimacy in the film and in the approach. There were 5 of us, the producer and me as the director, writer, camera, sound, and production coordinator. And it was so interesting because we were 5 women making a film, when we would show up somewhere and with the gear and everything, or even when we'd go into a restaurant in a village or wherever for a break, people really looked. This was something to see these women in what was, factually a very male-dominated profession. And of course, that's changed quite a bit since then. So it was exciting. There was a feeling of excitement, and it was very creative. And each of us were also feeling this sense of the empowerment of these women who had, all of them in different ways, empowered themselves through their expression and through owning their expression. And that was also really very special.
When you sat down to make this documentary, did you have all of these people in mind already? Were you aware of their work?
I was aware of the work, but I had a long list. I think at one point I went back to look at my archives for Erotica, and I had, I think, a list of at least 50 women that I was intrigued by and was researching. And then, of course, that's because I did train as a journalist. I really come from a place of diligent research. And because of my interest in writing, I'm not intimidated. I love reading, and I love reading as much as possible, and I absorb it like a sponge. Then that I spoke to many, many women, and then that compressed. And the direction of the film in terms of choices of who to follow or who to include really was about looking at different forms of expression and different arts. Photography. Bettina Rans is quite a celebrated photographer in France, and she had published a book called Chambre Close, in which she photographed women in these intimate surroundings in not abandoned spaces, but in like old hotel rooms and things like that. It's actually quite a beautiful book. At the time, some people felt it was pornographic, which I don't get, but there were so many different discussions around that at the time. She was really interesting. She was subversive, and that intrigued me. Also in San Francisco, Phyllis Christopher, a lesbian photographer who was doing really subversive work in the nightclubs and photographing women in alleyways. And she spoke in the film about taking back spaces, and especially public spaces where women frequently felt unsafe or were threatened, like an alleyway, and taking that back. Some were coming from a very political perspective. Candida Royale, I was aware of because of my research. And when I met her, I just thought, wow, this is one amazing woman, and really feisty and smart and strong. And Annie Sprinkle was a revelation because she's like a goddess, but when you meet her, it's like meeting Mae West. She's got the wig, everything, and the most grounded, lovely, generous person you could ever meet. I just really admire her so much. Ferry Butch, who was an early trans performer in San Francisco. Ferry Butch was someone I discovered when I got to San Francisco. And so in some cases, it was also about being spontaneous and discovery. Same thing with Catherine Rogrier. In that case, I had contacted an agent in Paris who represented a photographer who I was interested in. She was more of a fashion photographer, but she also did some interesting work with women that I thought might be interesting for the film. And when I met her agent, he said, no, she wouldn't be right. But then he said, do you know, or somehow the name Catherine Rogrier came up because I had read L'Image. And the agent gave me her information, her contact information, because I didn't have it. So I met her, and meeting her was a whole other trip.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And especially that it feels like night and day.
Literally night and day. Oh, yeah, literally dark and light, night and day. She was lovely. So again, I met Madame Robbe at first, as part of my research trip in Paris. The person that I encountered was this petite, lovely bourgeois woman who was married to a very famous French filmmaker and novelist, Alain Robbe. And when we went back to film, again, there we were, the crew, sitting and having tea with this lovely, very polite bourgeois. And then at a certain point, when we were getting ready to film, then she said, I'm now going to, she didn't want to appear as Catherine Robbe, even though people in the know knew that Catherine Robbe was Jeanne de Berg. She didn't want to appear as that. And I understand that, actually, especially now I understand that, because her role as a dominatrix was coming from a place of performance. She had been an actor. And so I understood that she wanted to have her costume. So she went to change. And when she came back, originally I met her in Paris at her apartment, which was by the Bois de Boulogne. But when we went to film with her, we went to her chateau in Normandy. It was all very French and very much part of that kind of French experience. And she was not like the kind of dominatrix that one would read about or encounter, or that has been depicted in North America with the leather and the whole thing. She was very elegant and wore, it was a costume, but it was very understated black and the veil. And if someone was to portray her, I would cast Isabelle Huppert. She had that kind of elegance about her. So when I started to interview her, and this is actually quite a funny story, she sat down with her veil and we're talking, but I'm still looking at her as Catherine Robbe, that very nice bourgeois woman I was just speaking with in the living room a few moments ago, having tea with. And she was now in character as Jeanne de Berg. So she didn't like that. And also because I was the director, I was directing the interview. I was directing the order of the questions, and she didn't like that either. And it was very funny because at a moment, there's this moment early on in the interview where she is talking, and I'm still talking to her like Catherine Robbe, and she picks up a hat pin, a very long and elegant hat pin, and she starts playing with it. It's in the film, actually, you see it. She's in Erotica. She's playing with it, and she's looking at me. And I paused, and I thought, oh, she's trying to psych me out. And I got a little nervous because I thought, oh my God, I'm interviewing a dominatrix. What do I do? I'm supposed to be in control. I'm the director. And then I realized that's completely absurd. Of course I shouldn't be in control. Let her be who she is, and that will be a much better interview. So that, this whole dialogue is happening very quickly in my head. And so, conscious level, I yielded, and she felt it. It was really interesting. And then I realized, you are now interviewing Jeanne de Berg, and she is in character. And in many ways, it would be like a director working with an actor who has gone from being whoever they are in the dressing room, and now they're in character. Talk to me in character and approach me as that person, because that's the persona I have taken on. Again, because I was pretty fresh, it took me a moment to understand that, but it actually was a really interesting click for me as a moment, because it was something that I discovered was really about interviewing process. Know who you are interviewing and understand that it's important to adapt to the situation if you want the best and most authentic interview with someone. Turns out that one of her supplicantes was upstairs in the chambre secrète. And we're like, oh my God, could we meet him? No, of course not. Could we film? No. And then at a certain point, because we had been talking a long time, the production coordinator said, we really should let you go. We're keeping him waiting. And Catherine Robbe looked at her and said, you still don't get it, do you? I thought that was very funny.
Ultimately, how was Erotica: Journey into Female Sexuality received?
So the film premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. It was received very well. The distributor at first was unsure about the film because I think many people had an idea of what the film was going to be. And some people found it disturbing that some of the women were not the visual fantasy, the kind of woman they wanted to hear from. In some cases, I think it pushed buttons for a lot of people in different ways. Also, the way that it kind of moved between queerness and heterosexual expressions and didn't really make these big distinctions. It unnerved some women and it unnerved some men. The distributor had shown the film at TIFF. They had screenings for other film festival directors and distributors. There was talk of showing it at the Berlin Film Festival, which would have seemed like a perfect fit. But again, this was an early film. This came out in 90, and feminist discussions around erotica and pornography were still in a very delicate stage. So apparently, or so I was told by the distributor, even though the director wanted to show the film, some of the women who were part of the decision-making process did not show the film because they felt it was not a feminist film. The irony is, a few years later, the film has actually been celebrated as a feminist film, as an understanding of approaching it from a feminist perspective of the range and diversity of female expression. So the interesting thing is, many years later, I think it was in 2017, I had a retrospective of my films at Hot Docs, which is a big Canadian documentary film festival. And when we showed Erotica, Journey Into Sexuality, it was, 98. And then, so it was 20 years after the film had been made. And I was very curious to see how people would respond. And it was so intriguing to me because all these young women came up to me after and said, "You made that film 20 years ago? Wow, it feels so current." It's the kind of thing that one wants to hear as a filmmaker, because I knew that the film was ahead of the curve when I made it. So there were some bumps for sure in presenting it. And I was relieved to see that, okay, great. Now people get it. Not everyone's going to obviously love the film, but there is an understanding of where it's coming from, because the discussions have really become much more complex since then. Obviously, some of the material in the film is disturbing. And that is, again, going to be reinterpreted now in a very interesting way because of questions around complicity, consent. What does the female gaze mean? Is there such a thing? These are all questions that fascinate me, and it keeps evolving and changing, those questions and the discussions around it.
Do you choose your subjects, or do you feel like your subjects choose you?
I choose my subjects based on my interests or what is speaking to me at the time, but I also feel very strongly that there needs to be an energy that is pulling me towards it. And if I feel too much resistance, which has happened, sometimes that happens with a film or from their subject matter, and then there's the subjects of the film. If I'm finding there are too many roadblocks, then I will pause and think, okay, what is that about? Maybe I'm not supposed to make this film, or maybe I'm not the person to make this film. Because it is very important to me that it's a film that would be a Maya Gallus film. And that doesn't mean nobody else can make that film, but nobody else can make it in the way that I would make it. And I want that feeling of point of view to come across in the film in a strong way. But I also want the people who I'm working with to feel that they have some agency in this, that they have agency in that it is a collaboration. And so I want to bring out their best selves and want them to feel comfortable. I'm not a gotcha filmmaker. I'm not interested in setting somebody up or putting them in an uncomfortable situation and then filming that. No, this is going to be great for the camera. I've seen some films that have worked in that regard that are great films, but it's not my approach. So I have to feel there is a strong organic connection to the subject matter or to the person. There's no question that sometimes entering a culture or subculture, like when I made a film about women chefs and how they are heading kitchens, and is it different than the male culture that has been spoken about a lot in terms of the toxic culture of kitchens. And that was the heat kitchen revolution. And there's no question that when I'm entering a space like a restaurant, which is sometimes in some cases a very small space, there is this feeling of, oh my God, and now we're coming in with a camera and we're in the way. They're in the middle of service. And so there is a bit of a dance in some of these intimate spaces of making sure that, okay, we have to document what is happening, but we also need to be respectful of that what we're documenting is actually unfolding. And so we're not going to get in the way of what is happening, even though there is a construction to the story, of course, and there is an intention to the story. And I talk a lot with subjects before filming about that. But of course, by the time, particularly when it's a verite film, and it's been going on for a while, they're pretty much sick of me by the end of it, and because nobody ever really realizes what they're signing onto. But at the same time, the good part of it is when they see the film, then they say to me, you got it, you understood something. And that's because I was persistent and constantly showing up and sometimes in their face or sometimes being there when there was a failure or a mishap and the things that people don't necessarily want on camera. And I would explain, this is actually a really important part of showing what you do and the process. And people understand that, thankfully.
What are you working on now?
I'm working on 2 films, both in development. One is developing a film about Fashion Cares, which was an event that started in the 90s to raise money within the fashion community for AIDS. And it was an urgent need because there was no government funding at the time. It was a desperate time. And fashion, as well as the entertainment industries, were being decimated. So the community gathered together. It's very much a film about this community from the street engagement and what was happening at the time around queer activism. It's very relevant now as so many rights are being pushed back, challenged, and threatened. We're in a place that, honestly, I never thought we would be in again, and I think many people didn't think we would be in again. It's a film that I think will speak to younger generations of people who not really aware of what that experience was like of living through the AIDS crisis. Young fashion students, for example, are going to be in the film who are discovering the story and figuring out for themselves what does that mean in terms of our expression today. And one of the beauties for me of the film is that here was this ravaging disease that was really represented at the time so much of shame and secrecy. And here was the fashion community celebrating it with joyousness and beauty and glamour. And in the face of all of this, saying, we're here and look at how beautiful this is. And people like RuPaul and Katie Lang and later Pamela Anderson were spokespeople who hosted these events. And it was really a very expansive and extraordinary time. Oh, and so the other film, I had made a film about waitressing called Dish, Women Waitressing in the Art of Service, because I had been a female server myself. And I looked at from truck stops to high-end in France where women servers were not allowed to serve. And then I went to Tokyo to the maid cafes. It was a very interesting experience. And as a result of researching that, I became interested in female chefs and was reading a lot about women chefs and the experience of being a woman chef and what that meant in terms of running a restaurant. That led to the heated kitchen revolution. As a result of reading about women chefs, I started to read a lot about women and this whole sort of domestic history of that. And I had always been interested in Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein. And so I'm making a film about Alice B. Toklas, very early stages, really looking at who she was in her own right, not just the woman behind the shadows with Gertrude Stein, but this woman who had written ostensibly a cookbook, but was really a memoir, literary memoir, in the first of its kind, of its genre, and continues to have this extraordinary influence on popular culture today and on writers and artists and activists. And so it's a fun film to be developing, and it really speaks to me. And apropos of one of your earlier questions about whether I choose subjects or they choose me, when I'm making a film about someone who has died, of which the first was Elizabeth Smart, and I made that film because I had read after she died that there were all of her papers. She had 30 boxes of papers and things, photographs were in the archives. And so that was what inspired me. I thought, okay, there's a story here. But at a certain point, I needed to know, do I have permission to make this? And there was a point when I was losing faith, and I had a dream where I was sitting at a kitchen table, at her kitchen table in the country, and she came and sat down and just looked at me. And I thought, okay, Elizabeth's okay with this. And then I was the second of that sort of what is going to be a trilogy with Alice, is a film I made about Maison de la Roche, who was an internationally famous writer in her time, Canadian, who lived in a Boston marriage with her partner, Caroline Clement. And I was interested in the love story, but also the extent of her fame and how nobody understood that they were actually really a couple, even though when I looked at the Jalna series, which was the series she was most well known for writing, it was all there. One of her alter egos in the book is a queer character who is bullied by his brothers for being queer. Again, with Maison, especially because she was so closeted, I thought, gee, here I am speculating with some people about whether or not she was a lesbian and what that means. And people had different opinions. And I thought, I wonder if Maison and Caroline would be okay with that. And I had a dream that they were leading the pride parade in their glamorous first stoles. And I thought, okay, they're good with that. And Alice hasn't visited me in a dream yet, but I was putting her books on a bookshelf at one point, and I had taken the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is quite a big book, heavy book, and I put it at the top of the shelf, and I was going to put another writer who had written about her next to her, and as I was bending over, the book bonked me in the head, and I thought, okay, Alice, I won't put her next to you. So there are just these little ways that I feel like it's my own superstitions, but communing with people to make sure that they're okay, that I'm telling their story.
Where is the best place for people to actually see or purchase your films?
From our website, redqueenproductions.com, and some of the films are available as DVDs to purchase. We're slowly streaming them from our website. Erotica will be able to be streamed from the website shortly. So that is the best place, Red Queen Productions. We're also on Instagram as Red Queen Productions. So we're pretty easy to find.
Maya, thank you so much for your time today. This was so wonderful talking with you.
It's been great talking with you. I hope it's helpful.
All right, we are back, and we're talking about the story of O, and wow, there's O became a franchise, y'all. There's a lot of sequels. Yeah, we talked a little bit about the book, quote-unquote, sequel, The Return to the Chateau, or Return to Roissy. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff. It was interesting that the same year, I think you already mentioned this, Sam, the story of Joanna, the Damiano film, same exact year it comes out. And I don't know if it was one of those, and it doesn't feel like it, quick, we're going to cash in on the story of O and call it Story of Joanna. It feels like they could have come up with something a little bit more interesting as a title. But yeah, to have this other adaptation the same year, I thought was
it's
great.
definitely not an attempt to cash in.
The asylum version of Story of O?
The full moon version of Story of O with the puppet masters.
I'd read that Damiano wanted to do like the story of it, like he'd wanted to get the rights to it, but couldn't it was like impossible to afford. So he just decided to do something that was like inspired by it, and it's so great.
Jamie Gillis, perfect Sir Stephen casting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Much more on the nose. He's so icy cold in this movie. It's like I mean, it is believable because it's him, but I mean, it's just like you're just like,
It's
wow, like
scary sometimes.
yeah. I mean, what a great, and Terry Hall as well. I think the lead performances are so great. I've been wanting to see this movie for a really long time, and it wasn't until Mike that you added it to the files that I finally got to see it. And funnily enough, as I mentioned to Sam, the Damiano's children are touring with a restored version of the story of Joanna right now in Italy. It's going to show at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in December, and I'm going to go see it while I'm there. So I'm really excited.
That's so exciting. Yeah. It's something that they've been doing over the last decade. Like they also toured at least the US with a restoration of Deep Throat. And I haven't been to any of these screenings, but I know a couple people who have. It seems like they're just genuinely really excited about their dad's work living on and having people show up to the screenings and be so excited to see the restoration. So please say hi to them.
I love seeing them carry on their dad's legacy, and in a couple of Italian cities, they're basically doing like Damiano retrospectives, like they're doing memories within Miss Aggie, Devil and Miss Jones, and like basically all his greatest hits, like which is great. In Paris, it's showing with Let My Puppets Come, which is amazing, and they're gonna talk, they're gonna do intros for the film, so I'm really excited to hear what they have to say about it. But yeah, I think it's one of Story of Joanna is one of Damiano's best, and I am so excited to see it get the love it deserves, because it's really not a cash in. I think Damiano had a lot of passion for the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when we get around to talking about the image and in that episode, but it's just, I think there's just like a confluence of like factors around this time that all of these things kind of just started appearing one on top of each other, and so to speak. All these things appeared around the same time, and because it was something in the zeitgeist, like people just wanted this kind of content, just became something the audience wanted to see. So it was just like all these projects kind of came to fruition right around the same time.
I don't know that much about one of the producers of Story of O, Eric Rochat, I believe is how you would say his name. But I imagine he bought the rights for perpetuity, because he kind of made a living off of O after this, because
yeah, he sure did.
Yeah. So he produced things like the infamous Tusk by Jodorowsky. And he also did Sex Clock USA, which I haven't seen yet. But he would go on to do a 1984 Story of O2. And then he would also do Story of O, the series, which luckily I was able to track down all of that. And then he even made a movie in 2004 called Living O, where it's basically like, I am Sir Stefan. Really? Okay.
Yeah, I didn't watch this, but yeah, I was fascinated to read how Eric Rochat basically like as you say, like must have held the rights, and he died like not that long ago, like maybe 15, 20 years ago or something like that. But I mean, 2003. Okay, so yeah, maybe like 20 plus years ago. But still, like yeah, he was hanging on to those rights, and like he basically like I think he cashed in for the rest of his life on the owning the rights to that. So I don't know what the story is regarding how he acquired the rights, but especially considering they were like, so many people were vying for them, because like just to step back a little bit, I heard like Jodorowsky wanted to adapt this. Clouzot really wanted to adapt it, and Clouzot ended up, as I'm sure Sam knows, ended up like sort of taking elements, the sort of some of the S&M themes from the story, and then adapting that in La Prisonnière. They were like two people who were really wanted to do it, and it just never materialized. I can't imagine what a Jodorowsky version of this would look like.
I know. I like both of them. I would kill to go through a time machine and be able to see both those versions. And the Damiano version.
Yeah, for sure. One person who did actually, the actual first appearance on film of adaptation of the story of O was done by Kenneth Anger. I don't know if you've read about that, but it's not a full version. I think it's like only 20 minutes. I think it was sold to a few private collectors, so I think it's like floating around out there, so you can see stills from it, but I don't know that it's available to view anywhere. And there's this like really complicated, weird story where like the financing was tied up in like a famous kidnapping, and like the actors in the film were like arrested on the set of the shooting. So it's like fantastic, weird story surrounding like this sort of attempt to do the story of O.
Yeah, I have been wanting to see that for so long, but you could make a feature film about so much of Kenneth Anger's, so many just like random isolated incidents in Kenneth Anger's life. Like what a cinematic existence.
And then one thing I had, again, a discovery thanks to Mike, was the fact that Lars von Trier also did in 1979 did an adaptation of this, which I watched, and it's like, I'm not a huge Lars von Trier fan, so I'll just start by putting that out there. I'm not a huge, I mean, I respect him as a artist, but I'm not a huge fan of his films. But so he kind of like, for those who haven't seen this, it's on YouTube. I think it's not terribly difficult to find, but it's like a short movie. It's half an hour, and it's just he's kind of playing around with some of the visual motifs. And I read that von Trier apparently was also similarly was a huge fan of the book, and also of the book Justine by Desaad, and wanted to do film versions of both of them. And I think at some point he had approached Philippe Dargila, who is Pauline Réage's son, who is a movie producer, and said, I want to do an adaptation of the story of O. And he was like, absolutely not, because I hated the element of crime, which I thought was hilarious.
But I feel like he could have done, or he still could do, although the time may have passed, he could at least at some point have done a really interesting version of either Justine or Juliet. Because if you think about something like the house that Jack built and how fantastical and apocalyptic it gets, that's how Justine and Juliet both kind of are at the ending.
From films that I have seen and what I do, I mean, I know that, like, if you look closely at his filmography, you can see elements of these works like that sort of like crop up in like Nymphomaniac and Manderley, and like, so I've seen like references made to like, oh yeah, well, you can see, even though he wasn't able to film it, the book as the book.
I feel like Dogville has some things. Dogville is like Story of O as a non-consensual revenge tale.
One very interesting adaptation for me was Fruits of Passion, the 1981 film. And I was so surprised that it was Teriyama doing it. For some reason, always in my head, and I think it's just because of In the Realm of the Senses, because I always think that it's Oshima that did that. Because in Fruits of Passion, you have the love story / sex story, and you've got fucking Klaus Kinski. Holy fucking shit, is he amazing in this. But then you have this whole thing of like the anti-European rebellion that's going on in southern China at the same time. And it's just like, okay, it kind of reminds me of like, as the lovers are doing their thing in the realm of the senses, you have that whole rebellion or uprising that's happening outside the walls of that. And it's like, oh, okay, like to pair those two things, like the sex and the violence or the sex and the revolution, it's like, here we are with this again. And I love that Teriyama's right there in that whole mix of who else was it? Borovchik and Jaeckin doing Private Collection or whatever it was. Yeah.
Which is so good.
And just to refer back to actually a previous episode, so like I'm gonna quote a projection booth episode here, is I remember in the Lamarge episode, when I think it was Daniel Bird talking about the fact that Borovchik was approached by, again, Pauline Réage's son, or Dominique Aury's son, Philippe Dargila, to do an adaptation of the second book, and he turned it down. And then Teriyama was approached, and I think Daniel mentions that like Teriyama is one of the only like modern filmmakers that Borovchik kind of approved of, because other than that, it was a lot of like Eisenstein and early filmmakers, but that he, I guess, was happy to see him do it.
I think they have definitely some similar qualities to their filmmaking and how visual they are, and the importance of objects in both of their films. So it makes a lot of sense.
I was thinking about Borovchik adapting either the story of O itself, just in a sort of fantasy context, or the sequel, and it was just kind of like, wow, I could just imagine him doing so many things with like the objects, and just the fact that O herself becomes an object also. Like,
I feel like Lamarge is close or has some similar notes in ways, especially the idea of giving yourself over to this kind of sexual oblivion because you're, I don't know, actually grieving like in Lamarge, or just have such a deeply ingrained sense of shame that you want to give up yourself.
Heather Drain, our co-host for next week when we talk about the image, she wrote a fantastic essay about Teriyama's Fruits of Passion. Yeah, I'll definitely link to that in the story notes. And I think I actually linked to that when we talked about Lamarche.
Yeah, that was where I first read it, actually. And I reread it for this episode because I remembered it was so good. So props to you, Heather. I love Teriyama, and I love the idea of this movie and like what it, I don't think it's a total failure. I don't dislike it. I actually really like enjoy at least some parts of it. I don't, but I think first of all, obviously he takes a story, it kind of dispatches the story really. If it kind of takes some of the like some of the characters and like and just puts them in an entirely different framework. It's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful film, and the costumes were done by Kai-Sik Wong, who did worked with the Cockettes and Elton John, and just like did these amazing like costumes for oh gosh, who else? I'm blanking now. Oh, Dali. Like he just did like these amazing costumes, and it's just like they're so beautiful to look at, and that like sort of weird ring. It just looks incredible. And I'm wearing my shirt actually. My
shirt too.
I wore it because I knew you had it too. The funeral parade of Peter from Funeral Parade of Roses is sort of the madam of the house. So there's this great like queer subtext too, and it's just like I feel like it has so many great ideas, but I'm not entirely sure any of them successfully materialize. I mean, yeah, the colonialism aspect is great, and like there's some interesting points he makes there, and class issues as well, not surprisingly. It's just not the movie like you would want it to be, like based on.
I totally agree with you that the visuals are there and some of the thematics are there, but it doesn't feel like he's like fully cooking. Like I would never tell somebody to watch Fruits of Passion first if they had never seen a Teriyama movie. Or
it was one of his last movies, was it not? Like
yeah, he passed away like 2 years later.
Very shortly after.
I think he was actually pretty sick when he made it, from what I remember.
I'm trying to remember how he passed away. Was it something with his brain?
He had lifelong, I forget what the actual word is, but he had like lifelong liver issues. So he was like sick as a teenager, which is where he did most of his early writing. It's something that plagued him off and on throughout his life and absolutely shortened his lifespan. I want to say he was like in his 40s when he died.
Yeah, 47. I had Heather's article up, so I just saw that. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad that this conversation is so in depth because I'm fast, and I feel like I'm hopefully not over talking this one because I feel like you two have so much more interesting things to say than I do.
Which is crazy that there's a mini series.
It's long too. I'm like, oh my God, there's like 10-hour-long episodes. Like, are you kidding me with this?
There was a video store that was pretty famous around here called Thomas Video, to the point where when it was closing down, of all people, frickin' Tarantino came out here to raid their laser discs and other things. And Rob St. Mary used to work there, who worked on this show. And he said, hey, I'm going up to Thomas to take advantage of buying out some of these VHS tapes and DVDs, etc. What can I get you? And I go, well, the thing I remember from Thomas was there was a weird TV series of Story of O that I didn't really, I was like, I don't know anything about this. I didn't know where it was made, who made it, anything. I just said, if you can pick that up, I would appreciate that. So I actually have in a shopping bag, like 20 feet behind me, those tapes that Rob bought for me. And then I found the whole thing out online. So I'm like, well, fuck me. So I don't know how much money I ended up spending on that, but
like my home video collection. I remember there reminds me ever so slightly of just when I was in college and I was talking to my one of my advisors who's German about like I'd seen my first Fassbinder film, and like I was just like I'm like tell me everything you know about Fassbinder, like this, I'm so interested, because it was like this is like late 90s, and I didn't have, I mean I had some like there were video stores obviously, but I didn't have tons of access to video stores with like huge foreign movie collections. So I was like, I need, like, oh, I've just seen this movie by Fassbinder, like I need to. And then she like opens this cabinet drawer and there's like videotapes of Berlin Alexanderplatz, like this, I love huge that drawer of, like 20 videotapes. She's like, you can borrow these. And it's like, And I was like so daunted by such a task.
I feel like
was
one day I'm just going to get an overcoat and line it with the Brilliant Alexander Platz discs and be like, all right, kids, you ready to get into some Fassbinder? When I get arrested, you'll have to bail me out.
Yeah, I did watch one chapter of the TV series, and I thought it was pretty good, not too bad, but just I just watched the movie, so I'm like pretty familiar. Like, I think that condensing that into an hour and a half wasn't the worst sin in the world. I think the book, to read the book, it took that actress 7 hours. So the TV series is longer than the book. And then I did try to watch Story of O2 from 1984, and that was real rough.
I couldn't bring myself to do it, partly because my schedule's just insane, but everyone I know who has watched it is like, don't do it.
I know, I just kept putting it off. I'm like, I'm going to read this essay first. I'm like, I'll get back to that one. And it never happened. It's kind of like, I mean, some of these later adaptations, and I'll just I'll compare it to something like Emmanuel, just because, as you probably know, like, I was talking to someone about this recently where we were like, someone was saying, like, who knew I had, interest in, 70s European softcore and this type of erotic movie adaptations, and was like, oh, the remaking the Emmanuel, I watched it, and are you going to watch it? I'm just like, no, I'm not going to watch it. I'm like, they're like, oh, but it was directed by a woman. I'm like, do I want to see like Emmanuel set in a modern context with modern values imposed upon it? Like, no, I don't want to see that. I want to see gauzy softcore and things that you wouldn't see in a movie now. I want to see the wicker chair and feather boas, like, and Thailand. Like, I don't want to see like a modern adaptation of it. Absolutely not. So it'd be like, it makes me think, like, if someone tried to adapt Story of O today, like what kind of changes, you think they might impose on it. I just think it's I think you couldn't do it.
I don't think you could do it. In fact, you'll be pleased to learn that they did, and it's called the 50 Shades of Grey series.
Get out of here with that nonsense. Get out of here with that nonsense. Yeah.
I'm signing off now.
Well, welcome to my world.
I did in my research, like when I was looking for articles about Story of O, I did come across like basically someone doing a comparative study, and and they were not kind to the more current version.
My biggest objection that I have with 50 Shades of Grey is just how fucking boring it is.
And how, like, sexless?
Oh, absolutely sexless. And it's basically a book about contract negotiations. And I'm just like, I don't care. I don't care about your bloody contract that you just keep mulling over.
Contract negotiations, and also this idea of, like, ownership. The way it's presented in Story of O, it's like the radical opposite in 50 Shades, well, at least in the first one, where it basically becomes like, okay, I want a trad wife. That's all he's looking for. And I haven't seen all the movies, but my understanding is that the way it ends is she's basically, okay, but if you really loved me, you wouldn't be such a pervert. And he's like, you're right, I do really love you. The end.
Does she stamp a cigarette holder?
Yes.
I'm going to take y'all's word for it because I have not read the books or seen the movies. There's just absolutely like no way, I'm going to invest.
The first one's really funny because of the line delivery, but it's like,
what's a butt plug?
Yes, it's
no, really?
Who doesn't have Google? First of all. Second of all, it's the sort of thing that, like, if you're really suffering on a long airplane ride and you want something worse than the airplane, like, this is the movie.
It's like, I'm going to take this over the airport map or the airplane, the geo map.
I listened to the book, or tried to, and I just remember how abusive they were. The thing that gets abused the most in the book is adverbs, because she has to put in
a sign of quality writing.
Good Lord, yes.
Those poor adverbs.
Those adverbs were just being mauled in that. Oh God, it was so bad, and it was like car crash kind of thing where you're just like fascinated by just how bad it is. But I eventually just popped out that I popped out that CD and I threw it out my window because I was like, I don't want this anywhere near me. I'd be tempted to listen to more, and I think it's absolute garbage.
we don't need to be digressing into this right now. So you know what? Never mind. I'm not even gonna follow up with that comment. It's garbage.
But I will say, Story of O2 from 1984, a little bit better than 50 Shades, but the acting is so atrocious.
So it is in 50 Shades.
Page 1. Strike out my old address and replace with a new one.
An oversight. Duly noted.
Page 3, section 1520. The submissive shall submit to any sexual activity demanded by the dominant and shall do so without hesitation or argument. Turn to page 5, appendix 3, soft limits.
With you.
Find anal fisting.
I'm all ears.
Strike it out. Strike out vaginal fisting too.
You sure?
Yeah. Same page. Is the use of sex toys acceptable to the submissive? Vibrators okay. Dildos fine. Genital clamps? Absolutely not.
Consider them gone.
What are butt plugs?
Doesn't Guido Crepax, like, he did the novel proper, but didn't he also do like these, like, didn't he sort of do an adaptation of the sequel, the film sequel? Like, because there's like appendices of like text that I tried to glance through them quickly. I'm like, I don't remember this. When does this happen? Like, where is he getting this? Like sort of like Madame O or something like that. Does that, so I have to look through that again because I don't know what the source material is for something, because he did some of these appendices to his version of the story of O in the 80s. So I'm just wondering if he like decided to borrow some from the film sequel.
That's a good question. I always assumed that they were just like stories he made up.
He just made up. I mean, it could be. I actually don't know. No, because I wondered. I'm like, because I just couldn't. I was like, where the hell does this like Madame O stuff come from? I don't remember this at all. Yeah, but it was, and I know it was done much later because the initial again, 1975, Crepax was when Crepax did the graphic novel of the original novel.
75 and 76, two of the best years of cinema.
Yeah, and you talked about how dark stuff got, and yeah, talking about water power and some of those things from 76, it's like, yeah, the world was getting pretty dark. I tried my best to find his story or Story of S from 1979, was unable to find that. I hear it's a parody of Story of O, Italian one. Unable to find it. So I tried my best, y'all.
It's probably still better than 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh yeah, it has to be. There's like a clip from it on YouTube that's 1 minute and 10 seconds, but it's the same scene repeated a few times because I guess you get to see it says un película de español, so it's a Spanish film, but I guess this actress, somebody was obsessed with her, so you get to see her a few times, and they slow down the footage. I'm like, okay, knock yourself out, guys.
Well, that suddenly reminds me because Jess Franco did it's in name only, but he did the sexual story of O, which again he fully admits, like, I just used the title, like it hasn't, and but yeah, it can, just to fit into the lore, there's that.
Yeah, your call as far as this being like Emmanuel, because they were just throwing Emmanuel. Emmanuel was like the Django of the 70s, where it's just like, we're going to put Django's name on this thing. We don't care.
But what I'm really waiting for, so there's a whole later series of Emmanuel in space. I want to see O in space. I want it to be like Jason X, where she just goes to space and...
It's okay. She just wanted her riding crop back.
Well, where you're not that far off is in Susan Sontag's essay, The Pornographic Imagination. She compares the genres of pornography to science fiction because it's creating fantasy worlds.
All right, let's go ahead and take another break and play a preview for next week's show right after these brief messages.
When I saw Claire again for the first time that summer, it was at a party given by, let's say the X's. The young girl in the white dress and Claire were friends, obviously. But beyond that, I sensed a strange link between them. A kind of electricity, although I had never heard it said that Claire was particularly interested in girls.
She has pretty hands.
Yes?
She likes doing that, It excites her. I can prove it to you if you like. She loves it when we put her on her knees so we can whip her, doesn't she?
It's getting hotter and hotter outside.
I regret, my dear, that we're obliged to keep our clothes on. But in our roles, you understand, it's indispensable.
To you especially.
Yes.
Don't you ever get too hot?
No. Never.
That's right, we'll be back next week with a look at Radley Metzger's The Image and another episode that's not for the faint of heart. Until then, I want to thank my co-hosts Sam and Jessica. So Jessica, what's going on with you, ma'am?
Not too much since last time we spoke. I don't really have anything to plug except my Instagram account, which you can find at la.bell.otero on Instagram. And just posting, just post about whatever I'm watching, whatever I'm enjoying at the moment. So, that's where you can find me.
And Sam, how about yourself?
Mostly in deadline and book finishing hell, so I don't have too much to plug other than my 2 podcasts, Eros Plus Massacre and Perverse Permission. With Eros Plus Massacre, I think the most recent things I've done, I did a Dracula Hammer episode, a very long Dracula Hammer episode, Hammer Dracula episode, and one about telephone-based slasher movies and thrillers. And for Perverse Permission, we are slowly but steadily working our way through the films of Hong Kong director Wong Jing. So if you like Hong Kong movies, there's probably some very punishing episodes to listen to, but also probably some interesting ones. We're on his comedies right now, and it's a bit grim.
Well, thanks again, ladies, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Do you want to support physical media and get great movies in the mail? Head over to scarecrow.com and try Scarecrow Video's incredible rent-by-mail service. The largest publicly available collection in the world. You'll find films that are entirely unavailable elsewhere. Get what you want when you want it without the scrolling. And yes, they have the story of O. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join our community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
Beneath the Parisian skies, a tale unfolds. A love that binds, a fire that coldly scolds. René's touch led her to the gates of Roissy, where chains became a language and pain a symphony. In the chateau halls, she learned to yield. Her body a temple, her will the shield. Stripped of her name, her freedom, her shame, she found herself reborn in submission's flame. This is the story of a willing slave, bound by love in darkness she gave. Her body marked, her spirit untamed. In the fire of surrender, her soul was claimed. Sir Stephen's hands were colder than the steel, yet his gaze unraveled what she dared to conceal. René's gift, a lover turned to stone. In Sir Stephen's arms, she found her throne. At some oasis among women who obey, her flesh was shaped, her soul betrayed. A brand, a piercing, a token of control. Yet in the pain, she found her role. This is the story of a willing slave, bound by of surrender, her soul was claimed. Naked beneath the mask, in owl's disguise, leashed and presented to lustful eyes. A room full of strangers, she stood as art, her body the offering, her soul torn apart. She thought love would hold her through the night, but shadows whisper there's no end in sight. A commander's hands, a crueler embrace, Sir Stephen's absence in empty space. This is the story of all a willing slave, bound by love in darkness she gave. Her body marked, her spirit untamed. In the fire of surrender, her soul was claimed. Abandoned in silence, her purpose undone. Would she choose freedom or the barrel of a gun? The story of all is not of despair, but of love's cruel hand and the burdens we bear.